And we welcome you back to In Focus. Maternal mortality is taking a toll on women in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Khalil Gay reports from Kaziba on a new way of making motherhood more safe.
Several years of armed conflict and social instability, compounded by a poor access to emergency obstetric care, keep the Democratic Republic of Congo among one of the worst countries in the world for a pregnant woman.
Every hour of every day in the DRC, 4 women die from the complications of pregnancy and labor. That is very important because for every woman who dies, 30 have serious pregnancy complications with traumatic consequences, such as obstetric fistula.
In the areas most affected by armed conflict, like the eastern province of South Kivu, the maternal mortality rate is high and complicated by unassisted childbirth and poor reproductive health education. Here in Kaziba, 37 miles from the city of Bukavu, people live in the mountains, in villages with extremely poor maternal health care. Pregnant women can spend days walking on rough paths to reach the hospital for care.
We have launched a national gender-based policy on the fight against maternal mortality, and we are also developing knowledge and prevention using door-to-door strategies to disclose the information to women. What kills more is the lack of information and the lack of access to equipped healthcare facilities.
That is why the Kaziba Hospital has adopted a strategy to reduce maternal mortality. When they reach their 7th month of pregnancy, women go down to the maternity waiting homes or binyola and wait there until they deliver their babies. Vumilia Luaboshi comes from the mountain village of Musheni.
I came down here to be able to benefit from the good services of the hospital because up in my village there is no ambulance.
But Vumilia has some concerns.
The problem is that we do not have enough room here, and when we finally deliver our babies, we must face the costs.
Better care comes at a price. Many of the women who use this facility will have to cover costs they cannot afford. But the hospital also has problems.
We have a problem when it comes to food management for the patients. The women must find their own food. Some of them flee from the hospital and go to look for a job in the neighborhood.
Despite the challenges, the maternity waiting homes are making childbirth safer for women.
Maternal mortality has drastically decreased here in the Kaziba area. Compared to the past years, we have recorded only 2 cases of maternal deaths compared to the 10 cases or more per year over the past years. Also, baby deaths have decreased 0.41 per year. These results are the direct consequences of the maternity waiting home.
Khalil Gay, for VOA News, Kaziba, South Kivu.
The mortality rate now is almost 1 of 10 children born every day in the capital city don't make age of 5. But when you leave the capital city, it gets worse because the hospital are like 5 or 10 hours away.
To aid his home country of the Congo, Dikembe Matumbo created his eponymous foundation in 1997. He then donated $15 million to build his own hospital, which bears his mother's name. You mentioned your mother's death had played a role in that she apparently had a stroke but was unable to make it to the hospital. Explain why.
There's no ambulance system until 2000 when I started installing ambulances in the capital city. There was never the ambulance system.
What would have happened if somebody had tried to take her to the hospital at that time?
My dad tried, but by that time there was a curfew.
How much do you think her passing was a result of not having the access to proper medical care?
It's still hard to my family. It's still very hard because we believe that she could have been saved. So I think if they could have taken her to Galema, which is another good hospital for rich people. It could have been 5 minutes away from my parents' home, and we could be safe. I don't want no other kids lose their mother from those same circumstances. That's why we have best trained doctors, better intensive care union, trying to put as many medical equipments, high technology in this hospital, bring all the best doctors from the United States and Europe, and to make them learn to tell me what we need and what we don't need.
In 2014, Matumbo gave us a tour of the 300-bed facility, complete with a pharmacy and a full-service meal program, all features considered a luxury at a Congolese hospital.
This is where we take care of our premature babies. You talk about giving life, gift of life. This is it, for free. Today is 5 years old, look at him. Very well.
And how big was he when he got here?
He was big as my hand.
Vous le connaissez?
He's calling me Daddy Matumbo.
Daddy Matumbo?
Yes, the man who saved me.
And the CT scan?
It's the biggest one in the region, and the third one in Africa. This is our baby. And this machine is saving lives.
Makes a big difference.
Make a big difference, very big. This is my laboratory. We're a lab technician. We do all of the tests. We do the tests all the disease, you name it. We get a lot of transfer patient. We have to come get the tests because they go to small clinic in the neighborhood and there's nothing. The doctor said, okay, go to the Matumbo hospital, get a test, get a result, and bring it to me.
The hospital has continued to further medical education and bring new services never before offered in the Congo. In 2016, they provided the country's first knee replacement surgeries free of charge. The hospital has treated more than 1 million people since opening in 2007.
You know, we just contribute to the society. That's all life is about. I just want to make a difference.
What can you tell about what the main hospital in the Congo was like prior to the one that you built?
Catastrophic. Lack of medical care, medical equipment, not enough human capacity.
And it's my understanding patients would commonly have to bring their own food, would have to occasionally bring their own bed, they'd have to go out get their own medicines.
Yes, that is still happening.
Talk about when you once went to the maternity ward and saw 10 mothers who were almost being held against their will.
When you deliver a baby and you cannot pay the bill, they will not let you go. You can be outside walking around, but the baby will never leave the room. If it have to be 3, 4, 5 months, the baby will always be there.
Until they pay their medical bills?
They pay the medical bills. And in 2004, I went to the University Hospital for a visit, and there was more than 20 women inside the room with their babies. They've been there for a couple of weeks, more than a couple of months. And I decided to pay the bill for all the 20 ladies that was there. We all are made here to help each other to make the world a better place for a generation to come. And if we don't do it, this world will be destroyed. So I'm glad that I'm doing my part.
Yeah, I'm in Africa. Yeah, Africa's my home. Damn America and what America thinks. Yeah, I live in America, but Africa's the home of the black man, and I was a slave 400 years ago, and I'm going back home to fight among my brothers. Yeah.
For these two African Americans to come home was a great, great significance because of Hollywood and TV. A lot of us have been taught to hate Africa. There was a time when you call a black person African, they'd be ready to fight.
When I get to Africa, we're going to get it on because we don't get along. I want to eat him up.
True significance of why the Scotsmen fought in Africa is because they came up with $10 million, $5 million for George Foreman, $5 million for me. London, England was trying to get it. Promoters here in America were trying to get it, but none of them could surpass the $5 million mark.
The dream is now becoming a reality.
Don King went to George Foreman and got Foreman to sign an option agreement saying that if King could deliver $5 million, Foreman would fight Ali. Then King went to Ali and made the same deal with him. So Don King now had both fighters, their signatures on a piece of paper. What he didn't have was $10 million.
A festival that will complement this great sporting event, the greatest sporting event in the history of the world.
Greatest of all time.
Of all time, Mr. Champ says.
Greatest event of all time.
With some dynamic...
Bigger than Evil and the Kentucky Derby on the same day.
The president of Zaire was willing to put $10 million of his country's own very scarce, hard-earned currency on the line, not for any short-term economic reason, but because he felt that the fight would be good in terms of promoting Zaire and also in terms of promoting himself. And as Ali said at the time, countries go to war to get their names on the map, and wars cost a lot more than $10 million.
Some of the most dynamic performers from Afro-America will be appearing down there at the stadium in Kinshasa on the 20th, the 21st, and the 22nd, along with the world with its theatrical release. It will be James Brown, who is Soul Brother #1, one of our top leading black artists. Yes, James Brown will be there performing. We will have B.B. King, the Spinners.
It's the first assembly in the history of all America where all the top-notch blacks of America and the people of Africa had something together, all on a world level. We're all meeting each other and learning more about each other. This is the first assembly among the American black men and Africans like this in the history of the world. And it's a big honor to be part of that, too. Plus, I got to whoop George. Got to whoop George. We're going to rumble in the jungle. Come on. Come on. Come on. Now go. Speak up, bro. For that.
George, is this fight against Ali will be the toughest of your career, you think?
Pensez-vous que le match contre Ali va être le plus dur de votre carrière?
Could be. Could be. I doubt it.
George Foreman, we didn't know who he was. We had heard that there was a world champion. We thought he was white. Then we realized he was black, like Muhammad Ali. But still, for us, Foreman represented America. He arrived with a dog, a German Shepherd, which immediately offended Africans since the Belgians had used Shepherd as police dogs.
Ali said the hometown fighter, and you're the out-of-towner here.
Africa is the cradle of civilization. Everybody home is Africa.
Well, of course, the fight was held in Zaire, in the former Belgian Congo. Kinshasa was the capital on the banks of the Congo. It was just before the rainy season when this fight took place. Off to the north, you could see the flickering of storms, and coming closer and closer. But it was very important to the promoters of the fight that this fight get in before the storms occurred, because once the rainy season comes, you can't do anything. I always thought the Congo had such a wonderful name, Conradian and all that. Somehow to call it the Zaire didn't have quite the majesty, but there it was, the Congo.
Mobutu was everywhere. He was the equivalent in Africa of Joseph Stalin. You saw his picture everywhere. And, of course, part of the vanity of dictators, they almost always, with the possible exception of Mussolini, he was half ugly and half attractive. Most dictators are unbelievably ugly or plain. Franco, Hitler. Mobutu looks the archetype, is the epitome of a closet sadist. Sort of guy, if you meet him in a bar, you think, oh, my God, who are the poor women who are associated with this fellow?
Come on!
And since Mobutu was an extraordinarily practical man for his country, down under the stadium, seated 100,000 people, were detention pens and rooms and chambers where you could imprison as many as a couple thousand people at once. Before the fight came, the criminal rate in Zaire began to go up, and a few white foreigners had been killed driving their cars. And Mobutu decided that this was going to be a disaster in terms of publicity. So on a given day, he had 1,000 of the leading criminals in Kinshasa rounded up and put in this stadium down in the detention pens. And then the legend has it, and I suspect the legend may even be true, that he had 100 of them taken at random and killed them. And the reason was a particularly simple one from Mobutu's point of view. Criminals who make a life out of it have connections that protect them when they're in trouble. And by making this kill of 100 out of the 1,000 arbitrarily, what Mobutu was saying is your connections are worth nothing. I am Jehovah. I am going to blast you out of existence if you fool around with me. And he made his point. Kinshasa was one of the safest cities, not only in all of Africa, but probably in all of the world, while the foreign press was there for the fight.
No matter how big you get, as a black individual, you're still a nigger. You don't care how much money you get, you are still a nigger. And when you start there by yourself, you are all alone. Well, I tell you when you become unnecessary. Can I get a drummer song? Can I get a drummer little taste?
Do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. Would you have somebody burn you up and lynch you and tell you where to go and how to look and then refuse to pay you? Would you have somebody take advantage of your woman, Jack, and you can't even speak to his? Would you like to pay taxes for something that you never received? Do unto others as you would have somebody do unto you. And I don't have to use the word FM backwards.
Katherine, Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Gus T. Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy, information for non-white people, victims of white supremacy. Today's date, Thursday, October 17, 2024. So I have been told. This is our 5th study session on Andrée Blouin's My Country, Africa. We are picking up kind of the midpoint of the chapter, My Rita, My Father. For my book, it's on kind of the midpoint of page 128 after the white dude came to check on her after her pregnancy. The quick audio snippets that we heard, directly going back to what we talked about last week and talking about the current struggles with maternal and infant mortality rates in the Congo. They said that was 21st century, them saying that this is one of the worst places in the world to get pregnant, go into labor. Wow. And that's even to hear that in the U.S. with all that they say about the dangers for black females because of white supremacy racism. Like, wow. Some things don't change. Dikembe Matumbo spent $15 million of his money. Even have to put the inflation calculator on that because it's been about 10, 15 years. Wow. And He even one-upped LeBron James. If you want to be competitive, he built a hospital and a school. To my knowledge, LeBron James just built the school. So, hey, catch up, Bron. Get your hospital too, man. We could use that in the U.S. too. The same problem, maternal mortality rates, right? Anyway, and then even they talked about current day. They said that if you get pregnant or you are at the hospital for labor in the Congo and you don't have the money to pay the hospital bill, hey, we will just hold on to little Leroy until you come up with the bill. It's been 5 months. We will be hanging on to Leroy for 5 months. We'll get to know him real well. Wow. And then they said, too, you got to bring your own food and all that. Like, is it still delectable Negro? Man. Then we transitioned the 1996 documentary film When We Were Kings, which looks back at the 1974 historic fight between heavyweight champion George Foreman and challenger Muhammad Ali when he regains his title by knocking out then undefeated champ Mr. Foreman decades before the Foreman Grills. I've said I've been thinking about that fight because that happened in the Congo in 74. Now that's a few years after the events in the book that we're talking about are all done. But man, and particularly in the context of the film Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, because you heard all the performers, B.B. King, and we are listening to James Brown perform Say It Loud, Black and I'm Proud in the Congo. And he did a full set of songs and such. And B.B. King, the Spinners, you heard. And I said, man, that's the theme of Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. It was that soundtrack. And they talk about all of the black performers that white people sent over to Africa, including the Congo specifically, to make us see, look how well we treat the black people. Look at old Satchmo play that horn. I think they did send Louis Armstrong over there as one of the folks. Look at old Satchmo blow some horn. We don't mistreat no niggers. Look at that. Listen to James. He say, play it, James. He say he's black and proud. Look at that. Right on, James. Anyway, importantly in that segment, When We Were Kings, this documentary, you hear, you heard them say that it used to be, that was Muhammad Ali said, it used to be if you were an African-American. Oh, Spike Lee, I'm sorry, that was Spike Lee said. It used to be if you were a black person and somebody called you an African, you'd be ready to fight. Some things change and some things do not. I thought, wow, how now, what? You don't call me no African? I am an American. I am a black American. I don't have nothing to do with no pretend black people and all the rest of them. It would be that sort of response. Some things change and some things do not. Let's see. They had George Plimpton, suspected racist white man, who was talking about the Congo, and he said they changed the name to Zaire, and it just didn't have the majesty. You mean like King Leopold chopping off feet, ankles, hands? Because ain't nothing more majestic than hacking off limbs in the Congo. That is majesty. Norman Mailer, different, suspected racist, and he's talking about Joseph Mobutu, who we probably will not hear about in this text, but very important. Well, I take that back. Retract. I bet we will. I bet we will. Anyway, but George Plimpton, Norman Mailer, white man, he's talking about what a psychopath Joseph Mobutu is. Man, that word. Anyway, he talks about how ugly he is and all the rest of the closet sadists, and I feel so bad for the girls. Like, what? And particularly once you get more detail now, how did Mobutu get to that? It really even made me think, how did this fight wind up here? You're not even going to tell me that no Don King, black dude, convict, that he just did all this and white. You'd be like, yeah, great, Don, get to it. Nah, man. Nah. Even, in fact, that was Norman Mailer who was saying about, man, old sadist, psychopath Mobutu, they got wind that a few white foreigners, they didn't just say foreigners, they didn't say, Brits, Americans, white foreigners. So if it had been some Ali's cousins from Kentucky, but some white foreigners got killed. Whoa. We got to round up 1,000 Congolese Negras. And he say the legend has it. That's one that is suspicious to me, because that could just be a total lie from a white man who is good with words. Legend, hey, you just killed 100 of these niggers. We got to keep our white folks safe while they're here. Yes, we do. Well, where is it in the newspaper that they killed all these folks? How did you find out about all this? Anyway, the Don King, he was the one who said, doesn't matter how much money you get, you're still a nigger. And then James Brown, Black and I'm Proud, September 1974. Incidentally, this is about 3 months before the zebra murders commence in San Francisco, the book that we just finished. I told you, as we were reading the zebra murders during the chronology of those crimes, Ali fought Joe Frazier, who was in attendance for the Foreman-Ali fight in the Congo, as was Jim Brown. Wackiness of the times. We will get to it. My Country, Africa, Andrée Blouin, Katherine Massey Book Club, audio segment 1.
Soon after my baby was born, my mother gave her breast to her. This is our way of the grandmothers establishing a direct connection with the child. It is the grandmother who gives her breast first. There is no milk, of course, but the act is symbolic. Calmed and appeased, the child sleeps. As for me, I did the same thing with each of my 3 grandchildren. This is to present the child with the world beyond its mother, to give it to the earth, the family, the challenge in which it will live its life. One speaks to the new child through one's breast. My mother went off into the brush and gathered a certain kind of leaves, which she inserted into her vagina to stimulate the glands of the ovaries and uterus in such a way that milk would be produced in her breasts. In this way, a woman who has not conceived for many years can still produce milk. Josephine was unable to find exactly the leaves she wanted, but she found others that provoked a yellow liquid in her breasts. And by giving her breast to the child, the mammary glands were stimulated into secreting. This was her way of helping me when later I had to leave for several hours on my work, and could not feed my baby. It was also a way of making herself indispensable to the baby. I was exhausted after the delivery. My little daughter was a big baby, 3 kilos 950 grams. During the first days she cried and cried. I was so tired, I cried too. I said to my mother, "You want a child? Here, have it. Take this one." My mother said, "It's your fault that she cries so much. I told you not to eat so many hot peppers when you were pregnant. I told you that you were going to make your baby cry." Whenever my mother and I had quarreled, would deliberately eat 4 or 5 big, fat, hot peppers, just to annoy her. She would shout at me, "Your child is going to cry, you'll see." And she was right. Finally, I could stay awake no longer. I said, "You take her, I have to sleep a little." After that my mother stayed up with her night after night, without any sleep at all. If the baby made the slightest sound, just a tiny N, my mother would leap up from her mat beside my bed, and soothe her. Although most of the African mothers left the clinic within a few days after their delivery, I was so thin and worn out that the nuns insisted that I stay nearly 2 weeks. I had had no contact with my father since I sent him word, through my mother, that I was pregnant. One day, while I was still resting there at the clinic, a woman in a nearby bed lent me her newspaper, Le Courrier d'Afrique. On the front page was a large photo of my father and a dozen other white men. According to the story, they were Frenchmen who refused to accept Pétain's armistice. From London, de Gaulle had made his famous broadcast announcing that France would continue its struggle against the Germans. In his call to Frenchmen everywhere to rally around him, he had particularly asked Africa to help him save France. Responding to this, my father and his group were leaving Ubangui Shari to join the British forces in Kenya as volunteers. Pierre Gerbalat, a pioneer of French Equatorial Africa, was chief of the expedition. Before he volunteered for the Free French forces, my father was one of the most successful businessmen in Central Africa. Those who worked for him considered him a hard-driving but good master. He shouted a lot, it was true, but he did not beat his men. He was good to those who worked well. From those who failed to do their work properly he deducted heavy fines from the wages. Until the war brought France to her knees, materialistic values had entirely ruled his life. Then, embittered by his divorce from Henriette and no doubt at a point in his life when a man asks himself what, in sum, it all counts up to, he heard de Gaulle's stirring appeal to Africa to save France in her hour of need. This ignited in my father a blaze of patriotism in which he expected to perish. This patriotism proved to be an exalted repudiation of all that his life had been until then, all the years spent in one design, to build his fortune. Before leaving Ubangui as a volunteer, he reduced himself to penury. He never expected to return, thinking the war would liberate him from life. I returned to Brazzaville and sewed for the CGTA again. My mother helped me care for my baby when I had to be away. She nursed Rita to make her happy, gave her the bottle when it was necessary, and sang the songs of her village to her. When my baby fell asleep at her breast, still nursing, she gloated. All grandmothers are proud of their grandchildren, but Josephine was puffed up beyond measure. She was especially thrilled because Rita was so fair, and blonde, with blue eyes that turned green after a few months. My mother would say, "Look at that, would you? Did you ever see a white make a black child? But here a black has made a white child. They can't do it, but we can." The things Josephine said were so naive they really struck one. My mother was extraordinary at finding remedies in the leaves of the forest. She could often cure illnesses by very simple means. For a child with sore eyes she would hold the leaves of a certain plant over a flame until the sap ran, then put the drops in the eyes. It was sensational how quickly they would heal. For a small baby, there is nothing better for sore eyes than mother's milk. A little trickle of mother's milk, no remedy on earth is better, but never in the ear, as that will produce an otitis. Fortiori or dysentery, the velvety tips of the shoots of the guava tree are an immediate cure. Josephine carried my baby in a sling on her back, the African way, and spent hour upon hour playing with her. Gay, young, and thoughtless as she was, at last Josephine was a grandmother. For so long she had feared I was going to be as barren as that sacred Mother Germaine. I was almost a little jealous as I watched my mother and my daughter together. But my Rita knew me very well and laughed when she saw me coming, from a long way off. In spite of all my defeats, I was still insufferably proud. I might be alone in my struggle to survive, but the cotton dresses I wore were starched and modish, and my plump, darling baby sparkled with health. She and my mother, at least, I told myself, were happy in their cocoon of love together. While I was pregnant I never went to Mass, but after Rita was born, I was drawn back to the church again. Although I had disobeyed the church's teachings, Rita being the cruel, sweet proof of this disobedience, I was still under the influence of what I had learned as a child. When Rita was 4 months old I had her baptized. The first Sunday I was back in Brazzaville I went to Mass. My feelings were very complex as I entered the cathedral where so many memories lingered. When I looked at little Rita I felt a sense of guilt with respect to her future. I remember how at the midnight Mass or Christmas in Leopoldville I knelt in front of the altar of the Holy Virgin, lit with dozens of flickering candles, and I said to myself, perhaps my unhappiness is a result of having sinned. I can't let my child be as unhappy as I have been. For her I would do anything. So I began to go to Mass again. I knew the nuns would say humiliating things to me. But if that was God's will and would give my child a better life, would accept that. This was true, but there was also a certain defiance in my returning to the cathedral with the evidence of my sin in my arms, and worse yet, a white baby, a bigger sin. I knew the nuns would interpret it as an insolent example to the younger girls who had known me. Halfway through the Mass, Rita began to cry. She was hungry. I didn't dare nurse her as I was still shy. One of the kinder nuns was sitting near me, saw my predicament, and whispered to me, "Feed your child, go ahead, feed your baby." So I took out my fine breast, so swollen with milk, and my baby nursed greedily. When the Mass was over the orphanage girls gathered around me, marveling at my child, but the nuns, furious, shooed them off. This was exactly what they most feared. My beautiful baby would undermine at a glance all their teachings. I went regularly to the Mass after that. My little apartment in the Salvation Army building was far from the cathedral. I was afraid to walk the great distance in the heat with my baby, so I would take a pousse-pousse, a kind of taxi used by the whites. It was a chair set on 2 poles with a single wheel underneath. A man in front of the poles pulled and a man behind pushed. They could run like this for kilometers as their endurance was extraordinary. This form of transportation came from the Orient. To build the Congo-Oceanic Railroad, the French imported Indo-Chinese labor. That was a terrible project in which many laborers died, the most heartless kind of exploitation. At that time, in Brazzaville, there were only a few bicycles and a very few cars, which belonged to the administrators, plus the trucks that regularly crisscrossed the city in commerce. These pousse-pousse looked charming. They were kept very clean, with a white cloth over the back of the seat, and gaily colored pom-poms dancing on the ends of the arm rests. When I was at the orphanage and went to Mass at the cathedral with the other girls, would see the European ladies and gentlemen being drawn up to the steps of the cathedral, one by one. I once remarked that one day, I too would like to arrive in a pousse-pousse. The very idea, the nuns reprimanded me. For whom do you take yourself? One can imagine the chagrin of the nuns to see me arrive, not only with this white child of sin, but in the splendor of a pousse-pousse. Impudent little bitch. But it was above all for my baby, because I was so afraid of the sun and the germs. At the door of the cathedral I paid the runners and told them to wait for me. They went to the Mass too, and then they were there to take me home. This cost me 2 francs 50, which was as much as I got for making a dress. But Roger sent me a money order from time to time, and that helped me to stretch my budget. I was mending my sheets for the CGTA's river boats one morning when Roger's boy appeared with a note for me. Roger, I knew, had been called into the service. He was a captain, living in Leopoldville, working for the Governor-General. His message said that he had taken room number 8 at the Hotel Regina and he wanted me to come and bring the baby. Thus began a series of trysts that brought me pleasure and excitement, but also a sense of frustration and shame, as Roger snatched time away from his work and his life as an upstanding husband and citizen of the white community to be with the baby and me. It made me proud that Roger was interested in the development of our little daughter. When she began to get her teeth and we could see a space between her 2 tiny front teeth, Roger laughed with joy. It's the mark of the C.O.W.S family, he said. Everyone in our family has it. We say it brings happiness. She is a true C.O.W.S. And Rita laughed to hear her father laugh. When a note came that Roger could see me, I would take a taxi and hasten across the river. The driveway in front of the Governor-General's office was always heavily patrolled with military guards who kept the traffic moving, so the taxi could not stop directly in front and we were obliged to park a little farther on. Then I would send the taxi driver into the office with a note for Monsieur le Capitaine C.O.W.S and he would leave work to come and spend a moment with the baby and me. Life is extraordinary. The Governor-General's office was later to become the residence of the President of the new Republic, Patrice Lumumba. Roger's office, which I knew so well from the outside, had so often looked at the great tree in front of it as I waited for him to come to my taxi, was to be my own office, when I was chief of protocol. The wheel of fate turns. During the days of colonialism I could not put one foot in the office of the big boss of Leopoldville. What could I pretend to, I, of mixed blood and a woman at that? 20 years later I would sit in that office. Sometimes, in spite of the enormous pressures of my work during those crucial days of the new republic, I would catch a glimpse of that tree, and with a wry smile, remember. My father obsessed me, still. One day I went to the British Embassy to ask for news of him. I learned that he and his group had become attached to the Anglo-Saxon forces that were now crossing the desert in Libya on foot in General Leclerc's column. They were going to meet the British 8th Army in the Middle East. One afternoon when I was delivering work to the home of one of my European ladies, I met a French colonel. He was leaving in a few days, he said, to join the Free French forces in Cairo. At these words I had to speak. Timidly I asked if I could give him something for my father, who should be there. The colonel agreed, provided the article was not cumbersome. That evening I had a photographer come to my house. He took a picture of Rita on the bed, fat and smiling, her head lifted to survey a world in which she was meant to be happy. In the corner of the photo I wrote, "Grandpapa, I am 6 months old." With a silent prayer I delivered it to the colonel, for my father. 2 weeks later a telegram was delivered to me in Poto. It was the chief of the quarter, in those days, who told the mailman where to find those in his sector. With shaking fingers I opened the printed form. The words were from my father and read, "I embrace you both very affectionately. I love you very much." I devoured the telegram 3-4 times, in a happiness that hurt my heart almost as much as my father's earlier rejection of me had. I was glad, yes, but after being in pain too long one can bear only a little gladness at a time, as one who is starving can take nourishment at first only in small sips. I had taught myself not to need his love, now a little time was necessary for my hardness to melt away. I cried often in a bittersweet abandonment to my new feelings. It was some time later that the colonel in Cairo sent me a letter from my father written in a hospital. From the letter and from the colonel I learned that my father had marched across the burning plains of Libya with a pack on his back like any ordinary foot soldier. In making his contribution to the war he had not sought any privileges for himself. Although he was the leader of his group, he looked for no favors, bearing all the hardships of the younger men. His health, however, was not up to the rigors of the terrible task he had set himself. He had heart trouble and high blood pressure. Now physical fatigue had taken too heavy a toll and he was completely exhausted. It was impossible for him to continue with the free forces. He was being discharged. He had given all he could to France. My father asked to be repatriated to Bangui. He had lived 36 years in French Equatorial Africa. Although he was white, it had become home to him. Soon afterward I received a second telegram, this time with a money order attached. It asked me to return to Bangui, to be with him. When my mother came back from the market I was still in a state of shock. "Maman," I said, and she saw by my face that something extraordinary had happened, "we have a telegram from Papa." And I read it to her. Josephine exploded with joy. In the first place, it was proof to us that at least he was alive. We had heard so much of the terrible ravages of the battles in North Africa that we feared he might be dead. Hitler had taken most of Europe and we weren't sure where my father might have been sent. It was not until later that we learned the extent of his illness and the reason he was being repatriated to Bangui. At that moment, for my mother, it was the undiluted joy of knowing, first, that he was alive, and second, that he wanted us. As for me, I wept. I was overwhelmed by feelings of which a large part was astonishment. I was astonished by my father's request. It was so far from what I had required myself to believe, all this time. Josephine began shouting the news all over the neighborhood. Within minutes everyone in our quarter knew that we had received a telegram asking us to return home to Bangui, and that there was a money order attached to the telegram. That was important, it was proof of the intent of the telegram. At once we began making plans to leave Brazzaville. I would not refuse this call from a father who was now lonely and repentant and in need of care. Henriette was gone. In the end, his one child was all this broken man had left. I too wanted the tenderness of family life with my father. I yearned for it. Even more than that, I wanted a grandfather for my daughter, who needed stability and protection. I would close the chapter on the first, sad part of my life. Now I had only one aim, to live for my child, to spare her what I had suffered, to make her happy. This time my father would not disappoint me. I felt sure of it. In the joy of our going home I would not consider any other possibility. Chapter 8. Grueling Enterprises and Tragedy. My father's house, bordered by large mango trees, looked across the main street of Bangui to the river. A few doors away, there was a café where the Europeans gathered to drink coffee or take an apéritif. After I returned home, my father noticed that he began to receive an unprecedented number of visits from the town's businessmen, on their way to and from the café. They would stop to ask about the health of old Gerbalat, as he was then known, and to give him their greetings. I never had so many callers in my life, my father remarked dryly. As if they wanted to have my news. One of those who passed our house frequently was an enlisted man from the artillery post that was not far away. Each time, he looked searchingly toward the house. "There he is again," my father would say. "I guess he's taken by our mango trees." Charles Groitz, with his colonial helmet in tatters, was the poorest of my suitors. Why did I choose him, from among all the others, to be my husband? From the education I had received from the nuns, I still had certain notions about what one deserved in life. Roger had been a man with a large fortune, and God had punished me for my affair with him. I therefore believed that I was destined to spend my life in poverty. When I saw this poor enlisted man, I thought, there is your fate. Accept it. Besides, there were qualities in this man that I admired. He was a hard worker. I had evidence of this from the beginning. He was an attractive man, but cruel. Above all, he was brutally racist. He loved me, I believed that. But he in no way loved my race. He loved me, perhaps for his bed, perhaps because he was a man and I was young and beautiful and desired by many men, including a general and businessmen of position. Perhaps it was a feather in his cap to win the daughter of the hero, Monsieur Gerbalat. But Charles Groitz had no idea why I decided to be with him, much less how to give me the peace of mind a woman needs while she is living with a man. The fact that I had adapted to our life at all was due to my education, which had taught me that my life as a métis should be one of resignation and poverty, hoping for nothing better than to be a housekeeper to a white man, to clean his house, cook his meals, mend his socks. Even this was considered a step up in our status, as it offered us a certain amount of protection. If we found scorn for our persons within our own house, that was only our lot. And I confess that this was what I accepted. I did not tell Charles how I felt. He had no idea of the constant duel going on within me between my outrage and my attempt to resign myself to the fate given me as a métis. I was constantly sad, because I knew I was cowardly, that I was putting up with things that I should not. I knew that as a witness to his racism, I was an accomplice to it. The only time I did not feel Charles's racism was when we were alone, just the two of us. But I felt his racism terribly in his relations with our domestic help, and above all, with my mother. Charles would not permit my mother to come into our home. He would not have a black in his living room, except as a domestic, to serve. Our boy he called Bakuya, which means big chimpanzee. We métisses had to make a terrible choice in our relations with our men. If we insisted on bringing our black mothers into our homes, it was likely to destroy our relationship with the men. The alternative was to sacrifice our mothers and live by the men's terms. My mother had to wait until Charles was gone before she could come to our house. And when we heard his truck coming, from afar, she had to flee through the kitchen, almost like a thief. Of course this hurt my mother grievously. She could not understand how this could happen, above all, to her daughter. "You are the daughter of Gerbalat," she would say. "Except for the governor of the province, he has no equal. And you fall in love with a white man like that? How can you stay with him?" I said to her, "Maman, the nuns taught us to accept such humiliations as inevitable. Give him some time to learn, perhaps one day he will be more kind." Alas, that was never the case. He never really changed. While I knew that Charles loved me, he gave me no tenderness, none of the words that would make a woman open up, flower in happiness. But he adored Rita. Poor though we were, difficult as our life was, because of his feelings for Rita, I felt myself protected. His affection for her was a strong guarantee of stability, I felt, for both her and me. When I found myself pregnant, I knew that Charles would give our child his name, that it would not be at all the same as with Roger. It would be the beginning of a new life. For Rita, and for the new child I carried, it would be different, and that was the important thing. When my pregnancy came to term, I had the privilege of being delivered, like a white woman, at the European maternity clinic, with nuns who were midwives. Throughout my pregnancy I was followed by a doctor and these nuns, a very different experience from the first time when I had no medical care at all. This time I was assisted by Charles, and there was the new sensation of two distinct relationships involved, this man and his child, this man and myself. In 1942, René, a magnificent boy, was born to us, and this created an explosion of joy. Charles was so proud, so happy to have a child, a son, and I was too. Like his sister, and myself, Renee also was born on December 16th. I have often pondered the additional intertwining of our fates, in sharing this day, and the same stars, to enter the world. My father was no longer able to work, and his trucking business was gone. Charles, who was still in the army, decided to start a trucking concern of his own. Although my father's poor health required him to rest much of the time, he helped us with good advice. Thus we arranged to borrow the money to buy our first truck. Charles drove it, repaired it, and made contacts for the goods to be transported. Like my father, he was ready to do anything and everything himself to launch the business. He was a prodigious worker and he had an astute sense of commerce. I continued to sew, to earn a little money for us, for every franc counted then. I made all Charles's clothes for him, his shirts, his undershorts, even his trousers and lizard skin belts. We hadn't the means to buy imported articles at first, so I sewed everything myself. Living modestly, we were soon able to buy another truck, then another. From my mother I had learned to speak Sango. When we were living together in Brazzaville, this was the language that we usually spoke. Now I needed it while working with our help in the transport business. I gave the instructions to the men and was always there when the trucks were loaded. Demand for our services grew. Charles meanwhile remained at his post in the artillery. In addition, he took on the job of managing a small coffee plantation 12 kilometers from Bangui for a friend of his, and there we went to live in its rather primitive house. Not far from us was the Mpoko, a large river infested with crocodiles. Our work on the plantation was supervisory. There was a black overseer who followed the actual day-to-day maintenance job of keeping the weeds and undergrowth hoed out from under the trees so they would be healthy and productive. Then there was the harvesting of the coffee beans, which had to be done correctly. But these processes were already well known to the workers, so it was just a matter of assigning certain sections of the orchards to be cared for each day. With the knowledge gained in the experience here, Charles was encouraged to buy a plantation of his own, 800 kilometers to the east of Bangui, at Bangassou. This was quite a different project, for there we were in the process of creating a plantation in the middle of the jungle. About 50 hectares were under cultivation when we got it, and I enlarged it to 100. I say, because soon after Renee's birth, Charles was stricken with viral hepatitis. Because of the war, it was not possible for the army to send him to France for treatment, so he went to South Africa to recover. Without me, of course, there was no question of my going with him, not only because I was not yet his legal wife, but because of the apartheid laws of that country, still in effect today, which forbids sexual relationships between the black and white races. During the 9 months that Charles was gone, I took care of the transport business and both plantations. There was no road to our property in Bangassou, and we had to leave our truck about 3 kilometers away and go in by trail through the jungle. The vegetation there was dense, only workers who knew the area well could find their way through. It was no use cutting a road for our truck because in that moist heat everything grew so fast that a week later the road would have been obliterated. The first time I went in, with Charles, I was pregnant. The workers made a litter of 2 poles and a sling of liane vines and carried me in. When the coffee was harvested, it also had to be taken out on foot. A procession of men carried the precious bags on their shoulders to the road, where the truck was waiting. To enlarge the plantation we had to cut down huge trees, some of them 50 meters tall. There were about 100 full-time workers. They did not have the saws and tools we do now, only picks and hand axes. It was brutal work. Sometimes the trunks of trees were as big as an ordinary room. In fact, a big tree has often served as a house for an African. He cuts a hole in one and takes shelter there. One of my first jobs was to create a nursery of seedlings. The women wove baskets of pliable willow branches, then put a banana leaf in the bottom of each one so it would hold dirt. A grain of coffee or a sprouted seedling was placed in each basket to root. The soil was black and extremely fertile. On the roads the earth is red clay, but in the jungle, with all that drops and rots, the earth is black and rich. When one of the giant trees was cut down, there would be no other heavy vegetation within the circumference of its branches because all that grows in the big tree's shade is much smaller and weaker. The growth of other trees is smothered. After clearing a stretch of land, we would trace out the rows in which the coffee trees were to stand, and then, at the proper intervals, put the baskets of seedlings directly into the ground. Our workers came from villages that were not far away. They were well paid by general standards, and they hadn't the expenses of people in town. Their huts cost them nothing, they could put one up in an hour or two, and they lived largely on the animals they caught. The women planted peanuts, manioc, and vegetables beside their huts, and occasionally they brought in provisions from their own villages. Above all, the men hunted. The forest was rich in game, antelopes, buffaloes, wild pigs, and feathered game, such as guinea fowl. Cages were built in which to keep live such captured poultry. The men used bows and arrows for game in the trees. For the big land animals they used their sagais, or lances. Little Rita was with me, and I trembled for her because the area swarmed with panthers. Regularly the panthers carried off the goats and chickens kept by the workers, and a small child like her would have been a picnic. She was a lively child, curious and full of energy. I was constantly hugging her to me to keep her safe. The panthers were so bold they came even into the courtyard of our house. These panthers, tan with dark spots, were active at night. This is the only member of the cat family that we have in equatorial Africa. There are no lions such as on the Great Plains, which support the herds of hoofed animals. The panther holds a special place as a noble animal in our African folklore. But at Bangassou, when night fell, I shut myself up in our house with my child in fear. Snakes were another worry. They were not lacking, and included vipers that lived underground, and the beautifully marked black and white-horned vipers. There were rattlesnakes, and the poisonous green snakes that hid in banana trees, and the venomous, aggressive mamba, the most dangerous of all, which lives high in trees and attacks birds. The mamba must subdue its prey at once, because if the bird struggles and falls 30 or 40 meters to the ground, the snake's meal is lost. We had a nurse on the plantation, who carried serum to inject in case of snake bite. None of us was ever bitten by a snake, although Rita was stung by a scorpion. The most serious danger in the jungle can be the red ants or the manions. When they come, they arrive in enormous waves and can devour a human being in minutes, leaving the bones as polished as ivory. They sweep over their prey, asphyxiating it, penetrating every orifice at once, the nose, the eyes, the ears. They know exactly what to do, they head for the vital organs, the lungs and the brain. I knew of a case where the boy of a group camping in the brush was attacked while he slept. Although he jumped up, cried out, and ran, he could not be saved. The ants were already within his body. It was too late. This almost happened to us once. It was while we were traveling the long, hard route from Bangui to Bangassou, soon after we bought the property, that we had our nearly deadly encounter. We stopped in the late afternoon and our workers made us a little payote, or straw hut, in a pleasant clearing. This is not difficult to do. Some tall stakes were driven into the ground and the surrounding grass was cut and tied into bundles to fill the spaces between the stakes. The straw was also piled over a light scaffolding of branches for a roof. Several mats were spread on the ground for a floor, and within this little overnight shelter we set up the 2 folding beds and big mosquito net for Charles, Rita, and me. When one makes a camp thus, cutting vegetation, cooking food, and disturbing the natural order of the site, the ant scouts are alerted and come to see if there is something for their army to devour. This is their way in the jungle. That night I left the kerosene lantern burning in our little hut because the sounds of the night in the brush made me tremble. I wasn't used to the cries of the wild animals and slept only lightly. About midnight I heard a strange, rasping sound, KSS, 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 like a comb scraping on a bottle. I sat up and looked through the mosquito net. Instead of the straw-colored mats on the floor I saw a moving carpet of red ants. They filled the hut, entirely, their hard bodies rubbing together with a strange, whispering noise. With a scream I scooped Rita up in my arms. I tore away the mosquito net and jumped into that wave of red ants, for the door. Charles woke and with a bound followed me. Barefoot, we stepped on that horrible, seething carpet of ants. In the 3 or 4 seconds that it took us to run through them out to the trucks, my feet and ankles became encrusted with the ants. It looked as though I were wearing red boots. In the trucks were the driver, the boy, and 2 laborers for the plantation. They awakened at our cries and came to help us. Together we threw kerosene about and set fire to the army of ants. It was the only possible way to drive them off. I was badly stung, as was Charles. The bite of one of those ants is worse than fire. They have pincers like crabs and hold on to their prey tenaciously. You have to pick them off with your fingers, and even then the claws often remain in the flesh. To rid ourselves of them we could only rub our feet and legs vigorously. Because we had no alcohol with which to do this, we had to use gasoline to disinfect their bites. It was terribly painful. For many weeks afterward I had scabs where their claws remained embedded under my skin. I was happy, however, that Rita did not receive a single bite. She was then about 2 years old. I was several months pregnant with Charles's child at the time and ill with nausea and vomiting, besides. From then on, when we had to make a camp in the brush, we were always careful to surround our encampment with a protective circle of fresh ashes. Occasionally, when there was a lot of work to be done at the far end of the plantation, we would have to spend the night there. First we would make a bonfire, which would provide us with enough ashes to provide a barrier against the ants around the camp. It is curious that these ants, from which even a boa constrictor will flee, will not cross a little layer of fresh ashes. The boas of equatorial Africa are huge. In the jungle they can attain a length of 6, 7, even 8 meters. Their prey, which they crush to death, is sometimes so large that the boa needs a month to digest it. For this the security of a safe place is needed. After killing a large animal like an antelope or deer, the boa will make a tour of the jungle for 1 kilometer around, to be sure that there are no armies of ants that might attack him during the rest he needs. If he finds the area is safe, he returns to his prey and swallows it. But if there are manions in the area, he will prefer to leave his prey and look elsewhere for his meal. Not all boas live in the jungle. In Chad there are boas 8 meters long that live among the dunes of the desert. They leave a distinctive track in the sand by which they are hunted. When the track is found, a basin of poisoned milk is put out, the boa drinks it and dies nearby. The cured skin makes beautiful leather articles. I, myself, have seen these boas at Fort Laramie. They are terrifying. In the jungle, of course, boas don't leave tracks, so they are not so easy to find. Movies depicting Africa often show boas hanging like vines across a trail, waiting to make the acquaintance of some passing human, but actually, this is rare. They have so much else to eat in the jungle, especially monkeys, that they do not seek humans. The monkeys were everywhere on our plantation, even coming into our kitchen to steal food. Life on the plantation at Bangassou was an adventure every day. The work was cruel, but eventually I doubled the size of our productive land. When Charles came back from South Africa, well and strong again, and saw that I had not only managed his business for him, but actually expanded it, I think I convinced him that I was a worthwhile person. My work contributed, I think, to his decision to marry me. Although my father was helpful to us in the trucking business, he never really approved of my liaison with Charles Groitz. In the community there was more acceptance of a métisse mistress than a black one, still the French Catholic customs prevailed. I believe that the sense of honor and patriotism that inspired my father to join the Free French forces had also developed his conscience in other ways. His sacrifices for France had made him a well-known personage, respected and admired in the community. Perhaps he wanted to see me married and living a conventional life. There were many nuances in the situation. Marriage had never been a concern of mine. There was no question of our marrying when Renee was born, although Charles was mad with joy. We simply continued our life of poverty together in a small house. Renee had a name, that was what counted for me. But as a woman I continued to be frustrated, I felt my dignity violated. All the humiliations that I experienced as a woman of color living with Europeans I continued to feel with Charles in our own home. When Charles went off to South Africa, I arranged for my father to come live with me in our little plantation house outside of Bangui. I wanted him near me so I could see that he was properly cared for. Profiting by Charles's absence, my mother also came to help look after him for days, even weeks at a time. Thus, at last, as a mature woman and mother of 2, I was able to have the experience that had been denied me as a child, to live with my father and mother as a couple. They seemed wonderfully happy together. I was astonished by their closeness and harmony, these 2 people from such vastly differing worlds, an African woman who had been abandoned with her child, and a European businessman, now old and broken. This innocent, spirited little black woman and this bent, pot-bellied man with the often vacant stare. There is not a shadow of a doubt but that my mother adored my father until the day of her death. It was through her veneration of him that my own feelings came. I felt mostly admiration for his patriotism. I never really knew this man who had begotten me, but through this mother who was so naive and who bore so much unkindness from him, I learned to honor him in spite of my own pain and rebellion. My father's feelings for my mother were less original than hers for him. At the time their liaison began, there was no radio or television in Africa, and hunting was almost the only distraction for pioneers such as my father. Their lives were hard, although of course they had made this life their choice. Sharing life with a woman made it more pleasant, and of course she was convenient to him as a man. Josephine was a child when he found her, a child designed to love and please. Her heart-shaped face radiated the beauty of Africa, her smile was ravishing. When he won her with a larger dowry, Pierre Gerbalat was a happy man. Certainly the relationship between my father and mother was better than that which existed between most other white men and their black women. My father felt a real attachment for my mother. But also, one must concede the usefulness of the arrangement for him. Josephine provided pleasant evenings for my father, and he did not feel alone because he had this delicious girl for company. Now it was like a miracle to me to see them together as a couple. Teasing one another like children, their naturalness was touching. I was even a little uneasy at their frankness in front of me, once, when they spoke of their wedding night. My mother was preparing a poultice of herbs to treat a fungus on my father's face. As she crushed the herbs, which made a gluey paste, my father, who was watching, began to laugh. "I'm remembering our wedding night," he said. Then he turned to me and explained. "Your mother was so small and frail, she was still a child when I made a woman of her. Her parents left in our nuptial quarters a calabash with cooked gumbo in it. This was a native custom, to ease the rite, for the bride. Yes, I needed the gluey gumbo in order to consummate our marriage." At this my mother laughed quite spontaneously, marvelously, and said, "Yes, and afterward you wrote your name on my arm with a quill and ink. That was what they used in those days." Then together they went on to tell me about how Josephine's family, when they had seen the evidence that Josephine was a virgin, traced his writing in a tattoo of cinders. On her arm for all time was the name Pierre Gerbalat, spelled with a T, for my mother had the right to his name with a T even though I, their child, did not. Thus, in my home I was able to witness moments between them that were very moving to me. It seemed to me that they became quite young in their happiness together, although my father was not at all well. When my mother wanted to leave, my father held her, begging, "No, stay. Stay." I had the impression that my father invented little illnesses in order to keep her near him. Life, for Josephine, was not complicated. She wanted her small privileges of coquetry, especially a new pain each Sunday or at least twice a month. For the rest, she was an utterly adorable, heedless, child-hearted female, for whose smile one would forgive anything. A smile from Josephine was like a gift. It made one feel as though life, after all, was surely a success. I knew it wasn't true. I was sometimes exasperated by this when I was feeling so depressed, and she, in her blithe carelessness, found nothing to complain of. Her naivete produced some hilarious incidents. Once a Portuguese shopkeeper admired a solid gold bracelet that had been given to her and offered to make her a trade of anything she wanted in his shop. Josephine picked out some big enamel basins and other junk, then crowed for days how she had put one over on that foolish Portuguese shopkeeper. Josephine's life was entirely shaped by the usages of colonialism. Still, she did not resent them, she submitted to them easily, even joyfully. She never really understood the combat in which I was later involved, and often tried to dissuade me from my work, which she saw was so harsh and painful for me. Because we were close, inevitably she was touched by the problems that became mine through my political options. Eventually these problems were to reach the ultimate limits by producing her death. Although I am not religious, the cult of the ancestors is important to me. Each morning when I awaken, my first thought is for my mother. Speaking to her in the language of our country, I greet her, I tell her she will share my day. I tell her my problems, I remember things we have shared, I tell her that I love her. Sometimes I call other members of my family, my grandmother, my uncles, my son, but always my mother first. My father, I rarely have the joy of speaking with him as I do with the others. I am still too unhappy when I think of him. I have not yet been able to put aside my memories and to be quite simply, in my own heart, a loving daughter. It was my father who finally helped me to break away from the religious notions, learn from the nuns, that still haunted me. "I'll go to Mass with you, if you like," he said, "but just look at the church for what it is, all those theatrical effects, and always aligned with power and money." This put the church into an entirely new perspective for me. When I thought about it, I had to agree with him. "Then why," I asked him, my old pain rising, "did you put me with the nuns, those legalized torturers of God, if that's the way you feel about the church?" "There was no choice," he reffed. "There was nothing else available." At the time I had to accept his answer, but during the succeeding years I continued to ponder the mystery of my broken childhood. Granted that his wife did not want to be encumbered with me and may at one time have thought of having a family of her own, still, why did he and Henriette put me in that orphanage? Why didn't they simply leave me in the village where I was so happy? Was it because he thought I would be given an education by the nuns? But he must have known that the education from them at that time was absolutely nothing at all. If it was an education that he desired for me when he took me from the village, why had he not taken me to France, where I would really have learned something, since they were on their way, at that time, to France? The fact that he deposited me in that institution of purification, as the nuns called it, in Brazzaville, seems to me to indicate that he was moved by a sense of guilt. As I consider what his dilemma must have been, I think he must have felt guilt, not only toward my mother, Henriette, and me, but also toward the colonial system in which he had found such a prosperous place. Although he was not of a philosophical nature and would never have defined his discomfort in those terms, I think he felt guilt confronting him on every side. It was guilt, I think, that required expiation, somewhere, by someone. Burying me in Brazzaville among the nuns charged with dealing with such sins may have seemed to him the way out. It was during this peaceful interlude in 1943 when the three of us were together that my father recognized me officially and gave me the right to sign my name with a T. Only someone who has suffered such an experience can understand, I believe, what such a minor detail can mean. But even this long-delayed event was not without its bitter nuances for me. As he told me of his decision to take the necessary formal steps at the City Hall, he added, "If you had not turned out to be such an intelligent child, I would not have recognized you." I gave that statement a lot of thought. I think he found it necessary to justify the act because he was living in my house. He felt an obligation to me, but he wanted to make me forget his dependency on me. More than ever I felt pity for him. I answered nothing when he said those words. Even if I had not been a child who tried to raise herself in the world, I would not have been less his child for that. Perhaps he thought it would give me satisfaction to think, my father finds me intelligent. But that did not matter to me. I was never able to have any serious discussions with my father about colonialism. When I began to understand the usages of racism in the colonial system and to speak of it to him, he would say, "If the whites hadn't come to Africa, where would the blacks be today?" To which I would answer, "Look at it, if the blacks hadn't been here, where would the whites be today?" And so our discussion would stop short, because he saw where I would take it. I did not want to jeopardize our relations after he returned from the war, so I avoided painful subjects with him. I knew that he was quite capable of saying that the white race is very superior to the black. Charles returned from South Africa, strong and well, and apparently delighted to be with me and the two children again. In his absence my father and I had not only looked after the trucking business and the plantations, we had extended them. Charles was pleased, as well he might have been. I had worked like a man, taking the trucks into areas where there were no real roads, in order to pick up cotton, coffee, and other raw materials. I jolted over rutted trails, wondering what I would do, far from help, if the old truck broke down. When Charles learned these things, he saw that I was a woman whom one could count on, a worthwhile person who would add something to his life.
No matter how big you get, as a black individual, you're still a nigger. You don't care how much money you get, you are still a nigger. And when you start there by yourself, you are all alone. Well, I tell you when you become unnecessary.
do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. Would you have somebody bun you up and lynch you and tell you where to go and how to look and then refuse to pay you? Would you have somebody take advantage of your woman, Jack, and you can't even speak to his? Would you like to pay taxes for something that you never received? Do unto others as you would have somebody to do unto you. And I don't have to use the word FM backwards.
Godfather of Soul, James Brown, Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. I played that snippet at the beginning. I neglected to really, add any commentary about all that. The great Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, certainly. M.F. Maryland farmers, yes. Had to write and talk about that often. With regards to white supremacy, racism, people classified as white. But Andrée Blouin could have simply told old lame Charles, do unto others. Do unto others. And then James, when I played that back, and he said, do you want someone to be hollering at your woman, really at your child? And you can't say nothing to them. Now, James did end up doing a lot more than hollering at a white woman, cowbell, but whatever. That would apply too. What do you mean, where would black? Well, one, our population would increase by about 10 million if white people had never come here to practice white terrorism, so that's at least one enormous benefit. I don't think any population benefits by subtracting 10 million people. Do unto others, MFer. Supposed to be FM backwards. Sorry, James. Supposed to be FM. Do unto others, MFer. We ain't even got to say nothing else. They didn't say nothing else in the conversation, but I mean, really, do unto others. Replace white supremacy with justice. I had to pause one. There's so much material around all this. I'm pausing for two since I mentioned James. So pausing for one. The image that I used in promoting the broadcast for today is the railroad that they talked about. I think it's called the Indo-Congo Railroad or whatever the technical name, but oh man, that in and of itself is an example. Now we get to, where would the Negroes be if we hadn't come here? You wouldn't have this railroad. Absolutely right. We wouldn't have this railroad. Now, what was the cost of putting this railroad here? And for whom's benefit? Because you heard with the poos-poos. The poos-poos is for white people. Negroes, even Matisse, you don't get the poos-poos. So who gets to ride on the train? If it's anything like in the U.S., who gets to ride on the train? But that's not even the point. They have pictures, because she just kind of made a quick, oh man, the grueling slaughter of putting this railroad. OMG, MFers. They have pictures of the grueling massacre of the Congolese Negroes, and even they got some, I guess if I'm going to be consistent, chinks, non-white, non-black people that they tossed into the Congo to put this OMG. So you got pictures of black people with no feet, no hands, no ankles. Then you got the slaughter in that. They got so many pictures of Negroes in mines and down like 100 feet in the earth digging with a shovel and someone standing over them with a cachette or a rifle or both. They have that, like literally, they have whole books just about the construction of this railroad in the Congo and how many black people and non-white people got killed, raped, tortured, all of the above. There are whole books, dissertations, films, you name it, just about that real. And that was just a flippant comment. I'm not saying this out of criticism. I'm just saying there's so much material on the levels of white terrorism in the Congo, just the Congo, not all of Africa, just the Congo. It is mind-boggling. Now, two, that segment from James Brown. This is not sports talk, anything of the sort, but we are reading this book because of the film Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. A part of that film, or major, what shall I say, not argument, but a major subject of that film is that white people skillfully, willfully confused black people like entertainers, I was going to mention, but earlier, entertainers, Dizzy Gillespie and the like, to go to the Congo to play music, perform, and to help convince others that, hey, racism isn't that bad, we treat black people pretty well, and as a ruse, while they're going to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, who we'll hear about later. Already heard his name today. We'll hear much more about him in the second chunk of the book. But man, that fight with Muhammad Ali and George Foreman happens in the same area we're reading about, same area as the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, about less than 15 years after that murder. That documentary where you hear from James Brown and Don King and all these other folks, and they talk about the psychopath and sadist Mobutu, they don't mention Patrice Lumumba's name at all. At all. This fight happened less than 15 years after that assassination, which is still being talked about to this day, like books being published, documentaries, all kinds of projects. They didn't mention his name. What Dikembe Mutombo's hospital is on Boulevard Lumumba. That's the name of the street. They didn't even mention his name. And they didn't mention nothing. Mobutu is a psychopath and a sadist. They didn't mention nothing about, wait a minute, y'all killed 10 million black people in this area in very short order. That's way before we get to some Mobutu. If he's a sadist, what do you call a white person who kills 10 million black people and then has the audacity to say, what would you do without us? Live? The number 605-313-5164. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. James Brown in the Congo, Zaire. Do unto others, MFer. Godfather of soul. Email untiljustice@gmail.com if you have thoughts, observations, commentary. We'll nab a little bit from the email and then we'll get to some of the callers as well. Let's see. Email 1. Greetings, Gus, listeners, callers. Chapter 7. My mother went off into the brush and gathered a certain kind of leaves which she inserted into her vagina to stimulate the glands of the ovaries and uterus in such a way that milk would be produced. The white supremacists would take the knowledge, claim invention, charge the Africans for it, and make it illegal unless you purchase it from them. That some of this is in medical apartheid, how you had midwives and such, doulas in the U.S., plantations, who were doing all of this same work, had remembered all of this knowledge, use of herbs, plants, all of that for healing, medical purposes. White people took all of that and then outlawed it, made it a crime if you were practicing any of this, now to turn around and say that, oh, all this is needed, and maternal mortality rates. Full stop. Gus T certified prenatal yoga instructor, my prenatal yoga instructor, registered nurse, grandmother. She made it a point of emphasizing, because she told us to talk to, when you teach prenatal yoga, to talk about and encourage breastfeeding, because that is so much healthier. Certainly you don't want to be a Nazi about it, but at least, this is something to research, consider. It is great for the child, and she included grandmothers can breastfeed. She made this a point of emphasis for to say exactly what she laid out in the book, that man, it can be really hard being a parent, all kinds of stress, and you get tired and worn out, and you might not even be able. Some people have problems lactating, that yes, grandma can still breastfeed. I was stunned to learn that. We had to stop because I had questions about that. She's like, yes, healthy for the baby. Yeah, they even have reports. Grandmother's breast milk, even elderly, more healthy than formula. That would kind of be a yikes, but I mean, hey, all the reports I've seen, breast milk is out of this world nutritious. No competition. So it didn't really come as that much of a shock that, yes, even grandma, she can breastfeed, more nutritious than formula, that they probably don't have. Remember that? They had the shortage in the U.S. 2, Josephine, she was especially thrilled because Rita was so fair, blonde. Notice they didn't say she had a mop of blonde. They didn't say that. Blue eyes. Blue hair is a recurrent theme across multiple readings in the book club. Isn't it the first book where we had an actual audio book, entire thing? Bluest. And she had the audacity, Toni Morrison, they did an interview with her in the 21st century, because that book is in the 20th century, and she said, oh man, that's not even relevant now. Black females and black people got so much confidence and all that, and they not thinking about no blood. Victims guaranteed qualified. Toni Morrison, late great, missed as well. And you see, Pamela Evans Harris, late, she talked about that. This is exactly what she recommended. Do not ever do this. This is so poisonous. Tragic arrangements all the way around. But do not go around worshiping and doting on that child just because they are not black. Like, oh, thank God you don't have all that melanin. You don't have all that kinky, nappy hair. Oh, thank God you're so beautiful. Because what does that say about the rest of you? You're in the Congo, so almost nobody looks like that. What are you saying about the rest of us? What are you saying about yourself? Black self-respect, man. Come on. 3, Roger's boy appeared with a note from me. His message said that he had been taken from room 8 at the Hotel Regina, began a series of trysts that brought me pleasure and excitement and shame. Again, reminiscent of the clandestine meetings between Essie May and the esteemed Senator Thurman. For sure. So, tacky? Tacky? It doesn't get any better than tacky. And she does that throughout. Even that, she says Roger's boy, but she puts it in quotes, and she's done that repeatedly, where a white person will get their boy, even when the dogs, remember I played that with George Foreman today, he took his dog over for the fight. When they sicked the dogs on her, when she got uppity about the price of the dress, got the boys to go, get the dogs, uppity nigger woman, sass me. You're not men and women. It seems she knew that. Maybe she read Dr. Welsing. I don't know. But, man, let's see how many more times that happens. Boys and gals all over the world. That's always little children. That's why I said I think it's for a reason. It's papa le tat. I'm the daddy. I'm your mother. You don't sass me. I will put the dog on your sass white mama if you want to. Dog will be on your hind parts. Number 4. When my mother came back, we have a telegram from Papa, and I read it to her. Josephine exploded with joy. I too wanted the tenderness of family life with my father. I yearned for it. Even more than that, I wanted a grandfather for my daughter who needed stability and protection. I suspect this is all just manipulation on Papa's part. He's destitute, ill, and divorced. They are probably his only option for help and companionship. Andrea and Josephine think it's because he loves them, and he has that love in quotes. What a creep. Facts. He's in poor health. White woman left him, probably took all the money, and now I'm destitute, sick, decrepit, can't get no one to get my tea. Maybe I can get my nigger woman, my nigger gal, there we go, get my nigger, and literally, because this was child rape, I can get my nigger gal. You can come and hang out with me, keep me company, because she said he's making up illnesses and such. Like I said, companionship, I don't want to be old and by myself. Lord, come I'm about to die. Come sit next to me and mend my socks, hold my hand, get me a little tea, get me a warm cloth for my head, see? Come on. Now, if Josephine, Andrea's mother, if she had been sick, could she have sent her errand boy or sent him a telegram? My health, I'm not feeling too well. I'm hungry. Can you come? Chapter 8. Charles Groots, I guess. Above all, he was brutally racist. Even that, I had to kind of pause. Like, dang, 2025, most non-white people do not just haul off and call a white person a racist. They get many, many, many Cows listeners for years have been mad at Gus T saying, you get on there and say that all white people are racist, like I do that every program or whatever. Anyway, but man, that's kind of irregular to just haul off and racist. Seems brutally racist. And I'm even putting that in context. They killed 10 million black people in this part of the world. They chop off black people's hands, feet in this part of the world. In this context, to be brutally racist. Wow. What does one, because to be brutally racist in this context, it would have to be substantially more than just nigger, once, twice, I don't eat with niggers, I don't want, in this environment? She had a white woman sick a dog on her. Wasn't she brutally racist? And calling black people boys. I said then, these could have been like 70-year-old black dudes. Boy, get the dog. Isn't that brutal? So, wow. Number 2, Charles adored Rita, I bet, because she looked white. Hey, that's what the mom said. And even that's why they like Andrea. She's a little more, substantially more pale than Patrice Lumumba. Like, oh my God, you get her, stand her next to a regular black person with 2 black parents in the Congo. Like, whoa, it is okay. We got Obama's cousin or something here. Like, okay. That's why it's all the white. That's why they got all the powerful white dudes. I want some of that red bone. Like them exotic ones. Halle Berry. Not too dark though. Not man. And we read all this before. Half has never been told. They said the same thing in New Orleans. Get you one of them high yellow quadroon, octoroon, pay a whole lot of money for them. You got a whole franchise of that in New Orleans. Let's see. Number 3, I had the privilege of being delivered like a white woman. Remember the t-shirts? Please treat me like I am a white person. Facts. Matumbo, that's why he said he put the hospital up. Man, you go to that's a privilege. You go to a hospital, you got a bed. This was 21st century. You go to the Congo and go to the hospital. Wow, you got a bed? Wow. You got food? Wow. That's a privilege. Worst place in the world to have a baby. That's what again, that was 21st century. Ain't no progress in the Congo. 4, crocodiles, panthers, snakes, mambas, tigers, scorpions, red ants, boa constrictors, and still the most dangerous predators in Africa. People classified as white. Facts. That is like mic drop. Facts. White people go and hunt all of them, except for the ants. They kind of probably consider that, unless you're going to get like 1 billion of them, then maybe like, all right, maybe that'll be, I'll toughen up, we'll go out and eradicate them all. But the rest of them, like, we go out and hunt them. Like, oh yeah, go out and kill every snake in Africa and put that on TikTok. Remember earlier this year, we had the David Coulthard on from Rhodesia, not the Congo, but still, we talked about the safaris. Oh, go out and shoot all of the crocodiles, and panthers, scorpions, and boa constrictors, and anything else you could do. Shoot them too. You run out of them. If I see any of Patrice Lumumba's cousins, I'll shoot them too. Put that on Instagram. What does it mean to be white? Not even hunting for food. We just, white people kill for fun. We'll stop there. The pause for Kobe Bryant. They got the Mambas, the Black Mamba. Oh, raping Negro, but Black Mamba. We miss you, Kobe Bryant. All right, folks who dialed in, if you have commentary on the first portion, I will again ask, keep that in mind. So that fight, because, man, I bet if you went around and quiz, especially if you quiz anybody, I'd say 40 and under. You just ask them, Ali, George Foreman, heavyweight championship fight, write a paragraph about what you know. If it's only a sentence, that's fine. And then say, Patrice Lumumba, write a paragraph about what you know. Ooh. I would be ashamed to see the results of that one. Even with you all, like, you don't have to tell us, but that would even be one of the things. Now, how much do you know about this fight? How much do you know about Patrice Lumumba? Did you even know, hey, this is the same area, almost the same time period. Some of the same people are involved in both. Hey, what the deal? Indeed, indeed. Folks who dialed in with commentary. Let's see, Victim in New Jersey, Shamika Harris should be with us.
Yeah, hey Gus. Yeah, so I looked up, I googled pictures of the black female, and she was very, very beautiful woman. So I could imagine the white men that was trying to court her, or use better terms, I would say molest her. But yeah, very, very, very beautiful woman. Her mother, she often said, and she called her mother naive twice. And now we're going to have to read on and see her evolution, her awareness of colonialism, racism, white supremacy. But, one could argue that she's just as naive as her mother. I thought of Frances Cress Welsing when she was saying that her mother was naive, and correct me if I got it backwards or if I got it wrong or correct. if I have it wrong, but her mother said that black people are able to make white babies, but white people aren't able to make black babies. So I thought about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. So, so that was, I thought about that. Even with her saying that, her mother's naive, the fact that, she says, he loved me, but he was brutally racist. You spoke about that, brutally racist. I definitely would like to have more detail. Was he brutally racist in rhetoric and deed? Was he brutally racist? Did he abuse his workers? Did he abuse you? So when you say that he was brutally racist, what does that mean? But she says that he loved me. So definitely, definitely love definitely has to be defined. Like, what actually does that mean? When she said she taught herself not to want her father's love, but that was suppression, because the moment that her father did reach out and he was, unable to take care of himself, she took care of him, her and her mother. So that's tragic. That's very tragic. That you have to be in denial. You have to suppress your feelings. Knowing you really didn't mean that statement, because the minute that you got an opportunity that this white man gave you any interest, if he showed you any kind of attention, you were going to stand that attention and you were going to welcome that attention. So, I definitely that I'm wondering if the white father enjoys abusing the mother and the daughter when he makes statements, just statements about what would the Africans be without white people, and so I'm wondering if that his way of always, well, not even wondering, but I'm assuming that's his way of letting them know he's still superior. Even though he laid down with black female, had a black child, he still has to remind himself and them of his superior position. So it just within itself, that's tacky, that's cruel, but this is your father. This is the guy that you have to suppress your feelings about, and again, even the other guy that you're courting, you said that he's brutally racist. Your father also is brutally racist, and and just even with learning about the fact that they had knowledge of ways to make an older woman breastfeed. And I just still thought back when those men, again, they wanted justice. I know that they wasn't really, when they were saying they want to be Frenchmen, but really they wanted to be treated justly. But again, to basically flip things and make their society seem like it's backwards and that European white society is something to aspire to, when your society was just fine. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Africans had the abilities. They knew about medicine. They knew about building. They knew about carpentry. They knew these things, you know, but just to be able to come and devastate a society and also have them lose remembrance of things that they knew how to do for centuries. Then criminalize it, you know what I mean, take it, then sell it back to them. It's man, that's just wicked, Gus. I'll close.
What does it mean to be classified as white? For sure. Yeah, I'll get other folks who dialed in. Lauren should be with us as well. *61 if other folks have observations, thoughts to share.
Evening, everyone. Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. First, I wanted to say something about last week. I misread or misconstrued the part at the end. When she had her first baby, I thought the nun was saying, "Quick, give me the child." That was her saying, "Quick, give me the child, quick, give me the child." I don't know. I think I was so worried about it. I thought they were going to take her baby from her. Must have been a little, expectation bias. But no, that was Andrée Blouin saying, "Give me the child." So I wanted to make that correction. For this week's, I noted that part right at the beginning when she was talking about her mom giving the daughter her breast and establishing a direct connection with the child. I think, first, I wondered if this practice continues because of the widespread use of formula amongst non-white people of the world now. But I thought that the tradition sounded constructive, and that increasing that connection between grandmother and child, it's just very important for Black people. Even though you had some words to say about me speaking honestly about my grandma a week or two ago, both of my grandmothers have been two of the dearest people in my existence. I've never doubted the high levels of affection that they had for me. They taught me so much, were very nice, and I got in trouble a lot with the other family members when I was younger. Not so much with my grandmas. They were just super patient with me, and I'm really thankful for them. The leaves that the grandma she used, she said she wanted one kind of leaf. She wasn't able to find that one, so she used another one, and, it brought the liquid to her breast. I don't know if she called it milk. She said it was a yellow liquid. I wondered what those leaves were because it wasn't specified. She said the baby was 3 kilos, 950 grams, so 3.95 kilos, that's 8.708 pounds. That is kind of a big baby. She said and this is the part Victim in New Jersey was talking about. It said, all grandmothers are proud of their grandchildren, but Josephine was puffed up beyond measure. She was especially thrilled because Rita was so fair and blonde with blue eyes that turned green after a few months. My mother would say, "Look at that, would you? Did you ever see a white make a Black child? But here, a Black has made a white child. They can't do it, but we can." The things Josephine said were so naive, they really struck me. And that wasn't naive. It was accurate, and it also made me think of Dr. Welsing. Let's see. She said when she was pregnant, she never went to Mass, but after the baby was born, she started going, and I wondered why. And she said, for her, I would do anything. So I began to go to Mass again. I knew the nuns would say humiliating things to me, but if that was God's will and would give my child a better life, I would accept that. And then she goes to the Mass, and halfway through the Mass, the baby gets hungry, and she said, I didn't dare nurse her as I was still shy. And I'm not, she used the word shy, but in a way it seemed like she was embarrassed, like ashamed to breastfeed. And I think white people have taught us to be ashamed to do things that are very natural and correct, like breastfeeding. When she was talking about the pousse-pousse, the kind of taxi used by the whites, it must be a French way of saying rickshaw. Let me see. She talked about, I guess, Roger again, and there was a message saying that he had taken room number 8 at the Hotel Regina, and he wanted me to come and bring the baby. Thus began a series of trysts that brought me pleasure and excitement, but also a sense of frustration and shame, as Roger snatched time away from his work and his life as an upstanding husband and citizen of the white community to be with the baby and me. I don't know. That was just a continuation of more of what's already been going on in the story. When the father, Pierre Gerbelat, he sends the message back that, he's unwell or whatever, he's coming back and he wants to stay with them. She said at that moment for my mother, it was the undiluted joy of knowing first that he was alive and second that he wanted us. And I think it's very difficult for us not to want validation. It's not just them, but having a white parent or being in very close proximity like that to a white person, a white parent, and really having a white parent makes it much more likely you're going to have a white spouse or something like that, that really confuses us, and it's unhealthy. She said, once we began making plans to leave Brazzaville, I would not refuse this call from a father who was now lonely and repentant and in need of care. Henriette was gone. In the end, his one child was all this broken man had left. So she's going to do for him what he was unwilling to do for her. And she said, this time my father would not disappoint me. I felt sure of it. In the joy of our going home, I would not consider any other possibility. Just that statement right there kind of makes me think she did think about it. I don't know. She said what she said, but this person has been a disappointment her entire life. It would be crazy not to think of it. She talked about her father's house being bordered by large mango trees, and I thought that would actually be a luxury for, someone who's had issues with food security, for lack of a better term. There's been times in her life where she did not have enough food, and there are plenty of people around her who don't have enough food. She's in the Congo, so those large mango trees, they are a luxury. Charles Bruce, I was going to say I don't understand why she talked to him, but she said it. She said, he was in tatters, the poorest of her suitors. Why did I choose him from among all the others to be my husband? And first, she didn't choose him. He chose her. From the education I had received from the nuns, I still had certain notions about what one deserved in life. Roger had been a man with a large fortune, and God had punished me for my affair with him. I therefore believed that I was destined to spend my life in poverty. When I saw this poor enlisted man, I thought, there is your fate accepted. Fate, that's a very interesting word. That is the root word for fatal. So, let's see. She was talking about the new white man, Charles Roots, and she said, but he adored Rita. Poor though we were, difficult as our life was, because of his feelings for Rita, I felt myself protected. His affection for her was a strong guarantee of stability. I felt for both her and me. I thought I would be concerned that a man like that, cruel, racist, would molest that little girl. She's vulnerable. They're both vulnerable and easily taken advantage of. If he decides, he's going to do something incorrect, untoward, there wouldn't really be much they could do to stop him. I think it's interesting that her and two of her children all have the same date of birth. There was another part where she was talking about the vegetation being so dense, the only workers who knew the area well could find their way through. It was no use cutting a road for a truck because in that moist heat, everything grew so fast that a week later the road would have been obliterated. And I'm like, is that true? Like, even if you cut a swath through it and you paved it, it will be gone. Now, maybe if they just cut it, yeah, it would grow back. But I was wondering if they paved it, would that be true? I don't know. I've never been to the Congo. Let me see. Just all the hard work she did with Groots' business, and she kept calling it like our business or we or things like that. We bought a truck. Now Charles bought a truck. Let me see. I thought when when the ants came, she heard it and she was able to save her daughter, and they got out of there. They got some bites, but the baby wasn't bitten. So I think she did a wonderful job with that. And I mean, they could have died. So, she was really being vigilant that night. They escaped the ants. And it was interesting that with all that, they started putting a circle of fresh ashes around the camp. I didn't know that would stop the ants. That's super interesting. She said there is not a shadow of a doubt but that my mother adored my father until the day of her death. It's not that much difference in between her and her mother. Let me see. Life for Josephine was not complicated. She wanted her small privileges of coquetry, especially a new pagne each Sunday or at least twice a month. Not going to say anything about that one. She talked about the way she prayed. I don't think she called it prayer. She said, although I'm not religious, the cult of the ancestors is important to me. Each morning when I awaken, my first thought is for my mother. Speaking to her in the language of our country, I greet her. I tell her she will share my day. I tell her my problems. I remember things we have shared. I tell her that I love her. Sometimes I call other members of my family, my grandmother, my uncles, my son, but always my mother first. That part was just really, I don't know, it made me feel very emotional, and I think it's wonderful that she did that every morning. And that's all I have right now. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Remembering the ancestors, very important. Pamela Evans Harris, still with us. Dr. Welsing, still with us. Long list. Very important. Lots of different parts, even with the connection to when her mom, Josephine, was talking to her first child before she was born and all the rest of it, like lots of that being connected to folks who are not necessarily here totally yet. Very important, or if they're no longer with us, very important. How intelligent, Poos, Rickshaw, correct. The ash, I thought that's what a code. Now, I mean, hey, I guess if you almost die, you and your children almost died, then yeah, we might come up with a code immediately to make sure that this never, ever, ever happens again. And they even figure out a code for ash. We can do the same thing for racists. Code for the ants, not the ash. When she said the I guess roots or leaves, herbs that she was going to get, her Josephine, her mom was going to get to help with lactation, she said, dang, I'd be curious to know what roots or herbs they were. I would be willing to wager quite a few francs Miss Blouin didn't know. That's generally how it goes, where it'll be that information will be lost from one generation. Not that she, wasn't doing constructive things, but I suspect she just didn't get that information. She's in the orphanage and all the rest. They had to break out of there and all the rest of it and got parasites. That would be my suspicion. Again, medical apartheid. We talked about some of this. Harriet A. Washington. Both of you all, when you mentioned the portion about a black people can produce a white baby, but white people can't produce a black baby, and thinking of Dr. Welsing, I did too. And within that, I also thought of Sandra Lang. I thought Contraire Mon Frères, South Africa, no less, right down the road from where all this is happening. Sandra Lang, it's in the Cow's archives. Now, that is a case where two individuals classified as white in South Africa produced a child that was not white and ended up having her racial classification changed to not white. Now, there were some people, even Cow's listeners, who said, I think the mom had an affair, blah, blah, blah. There has never been any evidence that there was an affair. They had paternity tests done. All of the evidence that I've seen, unless I'm misinformed, we did programs on this, and I've never heard anyone present any evidence. It's just been, they think, rumor, legend has it, I heard on the street, that type of thing. With, BGQ, whatever, even if a white person took that stance. But I've never heard evidence that Sandra Lang's parents or has a non-white father. Never. So, that's one. And even if they did find evidence, they have whole reports that this is not a one-time anomalous thing, that because there's been so much rape in Africa, where you've got large chunks of land in areas where you've got very few white people and then large numbers of dark people, they go out and do this raping and all that. You end up generations later having someone who is classified as white, another person classified as white, they have a child, Negra in the woodpile. Whoa, what is going on? That type of thing. We talked about all this with Dr. Welsing, but Sandra Lang, not so, at minimum, not so fast. And that's not really anything to brag about, because that doesn't help us replace white supremacy with, it's almost, again, like, are we bragging about a white person raping a black child? Okay, let's get it back together. Replace white supremacy with justice. Pamela Evans Harris. Let's see, briefly, before we get to audio segment number 2, same thing I would get in. Wow, she said so much. I found it wild that her mom was upset with her for not being a teen concubine for white men. That whole big kerfuffle about this earlier in the book. Then she says her mom got upset with her being with this brutally racist white man. Dang, like what you can't take both now. Wait a minute, time out. Okay, mama, I appreciate you've been so helpful and the breastfeeding, and get you a new pannier if I can, but it can't be both. Now, you wanted me to be a concubine for a white man. Check. You can't come back and then you with this racist white man. Whoa. Now, unless you got a code to help me pick out a white man that is not racist, but it definitely can't be both. You can fuss on one, but it can't be both. Like, come on. Drive me crazy. Come on. Love you, but drive me crazy. Can't get both. Let's see. And you got to know, like, hey, aren't they all brutally? You got a white woman put the dog on you. Not paying you money, making you walk all that way in the sun. That's man, with Jiminy Crickets. Let's see. I guess the last one, she was afraid of the sun. That's why she wanted to take the rickshaw. She is pale. Her children are pale. They have less protection from the rays of the sun. And it is intense. They're around equatorial Africa. Yikes. Even the black people there need sun block. Protect that skin. Yikes. But the color white The Poos rickshaws looked charming. They were kept very clean with a white cloth over the back of the seat. And of course, they're not intended for niggers. Sit your black hind parts on that white cloth. Just the color white is so symbolic throughout this text. I mean, it is in the text, but I mean, wow, when you look at the pictures, it is staggering. White, the color of dominance. She used that term, devour food. I thought that was brilliant too. When Shamika Harris, she said they lived, or the white man's house had mango trees. Now, I mean, really, the Congo, there are mango trees everywhere. But of course, the white people take all the good property. So you have black people starving and getting parasites eating dirt. Mango tree in the yard, which they probably don't even eat the mangoes. Let them fall on the ground and rot. But she said she devoured the message from her dad, delectable Negro, and that is exactly Essie Mae Washington Williams' father hunger. I think Lauren had said, man, what is in terms of her relationship and need for white people and all that? Like, wow, definitive answer on that as we proceeded through the book, 2 children and moving back in with it. Wow, she devoured contact from her white father, child raping white father. Much more I could say, but we'll get to audio segment 2. If you didn't get to chime in, have additional thoughts, take notes. We will get to it. Mommies, grandmommies, very important. That seems like a big time theme in the book, yes? Katherine Massey Book Club, Andrée Blouin's My Country, Africa. Audio segment 2.
He hurled himself into his work again, and our life together was more agreeable and more bearable than it had ever been before. Even though his businesses were becoming major enterprises, he remained in the artillery. Charles seemed to have mixed feelings about the war and the occupation. Some of his ideas were pro-Nazi. He and his Alsatian comrades sometimes seemed more German than French to me. Of course, the history of Alsace explains a great deal, but it seemed to me that they insisted on the German aspect of their background. My father, in his unconfined patriotism, had some sharp exchanges with Charles on this, and I was disturbed by his attitude too. In spite of the manner in which I had been brought up by the nuns, I still had feelings for France, and especially my father's sacrifices had been a lesson to me in the love of country. Many aspects of Charles's personality displeased me. He was bosh, peevish, racist, brutal with my mother, and wildly jealous. His ideas about the relationship of a man and woman were strange. Although I felt he loved me, that he depended on me, he never showed it. I had to interpret this for myself. He hardly ever talked to me, he was very closed in on himself. But he loved his 2 children. It always came back to that. For the first time, I felt myself passively protected, at ease, for my daughter and son. So in spite of everything he inflicted on me and my mother, sometimes through carelessness, sometimes deliberately, I thought that, with the affection he gave his children, this was a lot. As for myself, I was used to having nothing, so for me, this was no real change. Perhaps it was my own father's apparent indifference to me as a child that made me prize Charles's attachment to his children so much. His affection for Renee and Rita was really profound. It made happiness for us all. When he came home late in the afternoon, I had the children waiting for him, all bathed and powdered. Because it was so hot, talcum powder was used to prevent prickly heat. Their little bodies were fresh, the skin cool and powdered. They were beautiful to see as we listened for the sound of his old truck, coming up the plantation road. When he arrived, the children and the dogs would run to meet him while I waited at the top of the steps. He would catch the children in his arms and swing them up to him. I found this marvelous to see. This was a side of Charles that was very precious to me. There was a great contrast between our 2 children. Rita was a Nordic type with large green eyes and soft, blonde curls that hung to her waist. It was not necessary to form the curls, but only to run a comb through them and they fell into long coils of their own weight. Renee was a fat little brown baby with olive skin, chestnut curls, and black eyes like his father's. He was not destined to be tall. Young as he was, you could see in his stubby little legs he would not have long bones, while his sister had the morphology of one who would be tall, lancée, as she is today. Rita was of a turbulent nature, lively and gay, with a strong personality. She was not one of those good as gold little girls, quite the contrary. She lived intensely, reacting strongly to every moment in life. She was a little tomboy, much more active than her brother, although of course he was younger. Perhaps he was a little dominated by his sister, for he let her do what she liked with him. He was a calm, good-natured child who watched his sister with big eyes, as she climbed trees or climbed on our big dogs. When Charles came back from Cape Town he brought with him 2 Great Danes. They were so large that their heads peered over the dining table while we were eating. Once one of them snitched a piece of meat off Rita's plate. She seized the dog's muzzle, pried his mouth open, and put her arm halfway down his throat to get the meat back. "This is my meat," she pronounced. We told her it was dirty, not to eat it, but she ate it anyhow. With satisfaction. She was so brave she would do anything. She chastised the dogs, and they let her do it. That was the way she was, confident and brimming with high. My mother loved the children so much that she absolutely had to spend time with them. Occasionally Charles would come home unexpectedly and find her in his house. Those were terrible days. The things Charles said then I have chosen not to remember. I protested, argued, denounced, and pled, but half-heartedly. I did not see any alternative to accepting this. The revolt was in me, but it had been stifled for so many years by the nuns. For all his delight in his daughter and little son, there were times when Charles was inexcusably brutal in his discipline of them. One night Rita did not want to eat her soup. He sent her out under the lemon tree, 25 meters away from the house, and there, in spite of the swarms of mosquitoes and the danger of panthers who regularly prowled the plantation, he made her eat her soup, alone, on her knees. The little one cried and cried, but he insisted and had to prevail. He would not let her come back until she had finished eating her soup. Then he took her, sobbing, in his arms. Even though he loved her, there was this iron side to his nature. Rita was traumatized by the incident, and I felt that it was too severe a punishment for a child who had not been raised in such a way. And of course I suffered, furiously, to see her so hurt. Charles's feelings for the children were sincere, they were not a pretense. He did not pretend. At least he was honest. He was hard with everyone, with me, with his children, with his workers. I would not describe Charles as handsome. He looked quite a bit like Clark Gable. Although not tall, he was a man you would notice, a certain physical type, intensely male, hard, complete in himself. What I appreciated in him, besides his tenderness for the children, was his enthusiasm for work. He had an unlimited appetite for work and could work 24 hours a day, smoking one cigarette after another and drinking beer. He was an enormous beer drinker, constantly perspiring, and drinking bottle after bottle of beer, day and night. He smoked more than anyone I have ever known in my life. The Africans called him the Lion, because he had an exceptionally powerful torso. When he was displeased with one of his workers, he did not beat the man. He merely seized him, turned him upside down and banged his head hard on the ground. Then he tossed the body contemptuously aside. The poor man was usually so stunned he could hardly move as Charles turned his back and walked away. Charles Groitz was not tall, but he was a block of solid muscle. One day he returned to the house, his face agitated, pale. There had been an accident, he said, and one of his men had been hurt. I didn't mean to do it, he kept repeating. I didn't do it on purpose. The army had given Charles a contract to transport bales of military garments to Fort Lamy in Chad. His men were loading the 50-kilo bales of goods into the trucks at the artillery post when the accident happened. As the men lifted and carried the heavy bundles on their backs, they sang. In work like this, when they are lifting and carrying hundreds of kilos for hours on end, singing gives a rhythm to their work. It makes their burdens lighter and the task go faster. They raise their voices in chants and songs. This may have irritated Charles, who was always of an impatient nature, and of course no one ever worked swiftly enough to satisfy him. He was there, supervising the job and shouting at the men to get on with it. He spoke Sango, as he had made a point of learning their language. One of the men loading the big bales was not going fast enough. Charles shouted at the man, hitting him on the head with the implement that he happened to have in his hand at the time, a tringle. This is a pole with a metal hook on the end of it, which is used to release a catch high up on a warehouse door when it can't be reached by hand. The blow must have been severe, for the man sank to his knees and then fell on the ground, unconscious. Charles discovered that the hook was embedded in the man's head and had penetrated his skull. Because it was impossible to remove the tringle, the man had to be transported, as he was, with the pole and hook, to the hospital for surgery. I was overwhelmed by the news. Privately, I thought that Charles could not continue to act like that with blacks because someday he would get himself killed. People would not put up with such treatment indefinitely. Already there was evidence that things were beginning, a little, to evolve. "How could you, Charles?" I said bitterly. "You haven't the right." Charles, of course, was not about to let me tell him what he had a right to do, concerning blacks. We had serious quarrels around this accident. The affair troubled him, not because he regretted what he had done, but because of the police inquiry. He feared it would reflect badly on his business and that his license to operate might be revoked. And besides, the truck was supposed to leave for Fort Laramie that day and it couldn't because it had been requisitioned for the inquest. After all, he's not dead, Charles kept saying. It was more important to Charles that the departure of the truck was delayed than that he had seriously injured a black man. The road from a boat landing on Limpopo ran by our plantation. People coming from the landing, on seeing our house, often stopped for a friendly visit. This was the custom of colonials in those days. A plantation, it was understood, was run by a white, and one white was always glad to see another. Hospitality was an accepted way of life. Thus I came to know many French people and began a small business of my own. France had fallen to the Germans. The war had left the French without food, they were suffering under the occupation. In Paris people were reduced to eating their dogs and cats, in the provinces things were only slightly better. Africa, which has always provided Europe with many natural resources needed to keep its factories running, was rich in many products that could not be had in the metropolis. The people in Africa began sending packages of desperately needed items such as sugar, rice, coffee, tapioca, white beans, and soap to their friends and families back home. One had the right to send 3 packages of 3 kilos each per month to one's relatives. Each sender had a card. Whenever a package was mailed, a little square was stamped, as a means of controlling the number of packages sent. The post office delivery system worked very well. The packages arrived as they should, and many people in France depended on them for their very survival. Because I had access to African products at wholesale prices, friends occasionally asked me to make up packages to send to France for them. Always willing to be helpful, I gladly did this. They paid for the articles and the postage while I did the buying and mailing for them on a regular basis. Finally, when people began turning their cards over to me and I found myself sending about 30 of these packages a month, I put out a sign in Bangui, "Packages for Families," and opened a little business. Soon hundreds of people had placed standing orders with me. I charged 2 francs 50 for handling each package, and bought the products at good prices, on credit. The packages were wrapped not in paper but in several meters of percale, which was also badly needed in France. When there were only 50 or 60 packages a month, I did all the work myself. I sewed the beige-gray cloth into sacks, wrapped the articles in protective paper, stuffed them in the sacks and sewed the sacks closed. Eventually I had 3,000 orders a month to fill. I hired 2 men as helpers, in those days it was men, not women, whom one hired, and who sewed. We had a regular assembly line production, one worker stuffing the fragrant coffee, the heavy sugar, and rice into the sacks, the other doing the sewing. I also had a helper who, with me, wrote the names and addresses of the persons to whom the packages were sent, in ink on the cloth. That was the part of the work that took the most care. Finally my business gained such status that the post office gave me the stamp for the expediting cards, and I began to stamp the squares myself as well as weigh the packages. When I delivered a load to the post office, all that was needed was to check the weight of the whole lot against the number of cards in hand. The post office relied on me to do part of their work as well as my own. It was a satisfying task, as one thought of how glad the recipients were to get those treasured packages during the hard days of the occupation. Later I raised the price of my services to 5 francs a package and still had all the business I could handle. For 3 years my Packages for Families was a highly successful enterprise. On August 3, 1944, General Leclerc, leading French troops for the Allied armies, entered Paris. For 4 years the capital had been a dead city, half of its inhabitants fleeing. When news of the liberation reached us, it produced a cataclysmic reaction in my father. His feelings, in fact, went far beyond response to that national event, I believe. He was sitting in the living room with my mother and the baby. Before preparing lunch I put on the radio to hear the noon news. We had always followed the development of events in France passionately. Now it was announced that, rolling up from the south, Leclerc's tanks and troops had taken the capital, and Paris was ours. My father, usually so dry and controlled, burst into tears. Within moments he was convulsed with sobs. Although moved myself, as who could fail to be at such news, was stunned by this display from a man who had shown so few feelings to those closest to him. Here in the hinterlands of equatorial Africa, thousands of kilometers from France and its fate, was a man who was utterly devastated. At first I thought, this is a truly rare patriot, he has done more, shown more emotions for his country than he has for his wife and child. But for a man to cry like that, to sob helplessly, without end. I began to think further. Certainly he was not weeping at that moment for the success in his country, but for the failures in his own past. At the mercy of his old age, without a fortune or a future, impotent before life, I think he finally faced, in my house, his regret for what he might have done for me. I think he wept then for what might have been. The Mpoko is a large, sluggish river that thrusts deep into the equatorial forest and keeps the land perpetually, sickeningly humid. Clouds of mosquitoes make a continual concert in the swamps along its shores, sowing malaria and even death among the unwary. Occasionally these clouds of mosquitoes swept into towns and infested the houses. Our plantation, not far the Mpoko, was particularly vulnerable to these swarms. Charles's transport business continued to prosper and my Packages for Families was doing well. We had begun to build a fine home in the center of Bangui when our family was struck by a terrible grief. For some time, René, who was then 2 years old, had been subject to bouts of malaria. He had an attack that was so severe that I was frightened. At the hospital I discussed his case with Dr. Vincent, our family doctor. He told me that René's condition was very serious, that he should be given several tablets of quinine every day. Unfortunately, in order to obtain quinine one had to have a special card, and in French Equatorial Africa this card was not given to anyone with African blood. Only Europeans had the privilege of obtaining shots of concentrated quinine with this card. The African children who were stricken with malaria often died because they could not have the medicine. This, sociologists said, was an example of the theory of natural selection at work. The process served, they said, to keep the race sturdy. I spent a dreadful night at René's bedside, alternately wrapping him in blankets when he shook in an ague of cold, and wiping his face and limbs with a damp cloth when the raging fever was upon him. Every breath seemed to rack his tortured, bronze little body. The next morning he was better, but the doctor warned me that René could not bear another such crisis. He let me look at a sample of René's blood in his microscope. What I saw there made me nearly crazy, hundreds of swarming parasites. He is so heavily infected he cannot resist another attack, Dr. Vincent said. When I told Charles what I had learned, he thought I was exaggerating the situation. I'll pinch some quinine from the army dispensary, he said, as if that would solve everything. The principle of the thing, that his child could not obtain medicine legally, did not concern him. That I was petrified, in a state of shock, he considered a case of nerves in an oversensitive mother. It could not be as serious as all that. That afternoon, desperate, I went to see the all-powerful mayor, administrator of Bangui, to ask him for a quinine card so that I could buy the life-saving medicine for my son. As I hastened to his office, against all reason, there was hope in my heart. Not only was the law against my mission, but already I had received one harsh rejection at the hands of this man. The French of Bangui met and socialized at an exclusive club called The Circle. My father, who was one of the earliest French settlers in the region, known to everyone and extremely well thought of, had been one of the first members. He was so proud of me that he took me with him to The Circle and presented me to the people there. One of the club members drew him aside and said warningly, "Actually, your daughter has no right to be here unless her membership is approved by the others." Soon afterward my father proposed my membership to The Circle, seconded by a godmother and godfather, two friends who lent their names to support my nomination. Among the club's members were the mayor, his excessively ugly wife, and two unattractive daughters. To see their faces when they looked at me was to know that they hated me. Quite openly they said that to accept me as a member would be to prepare the way for Africans with ambitions to join their private club. The only way to avoid this was to refuse, at the outset, anyone with African blood. The answer was no, and it was the mayor who reported this decision to my father. As I approached the mayor's office I remembered how it felt to be refused the right to go to the club's social events and to dance with the young men who were so eager to partner me. I knew that if the mayor had no pity for a young girl then, there was little chance that he would be favorably disposed toward me now, either. Still, I felt strong, combative. It was not for myself that I was making this appeal, but for my little son. As a mother I had no choice. In spite of everything, there is always a curious hope that lingers in the heart for each human encounter, that this time will be different. The hope of change, of rehabilitation, of a freshening of generosity to provide a new outcome. Perhaps, I thought, he refused me before because of his jealous wife and daughters. This time he would be alone, and judging the case of my innocent, desperate son, perhaps he might be more kind. I crossed the courtyard of the city hall, carpeted with white, cracked gravel. The military guards who were on duty outside the mayor's office asked me the nature of my business. I wished to speak to the mayor about the illness of my son, I said with courteous firmness. He is in need of quinine. The guards looked at one another with an expression that meant that I was wasting my time. But they let me go into the secretary and be announced. The mayor was an impressive-looking man. In the colonial system they always were. They were chosen to scare the Africans, to intimidate them with the white man's authority. He was not tall, but he was well built. He carried himself well. Pride in his role was written all over his face and in the way he moved. His hair was gray, receding a bit. His accent showed that he was from the south of France. Actually, he was an insignificant person, about whom no one would have given a second thought in France. But in Africa he had achieved power and prestige. More, he had the privilege of meting out life or death over the people in his little territory. He was alone in his office with a big desk, his shelves, and cabinets of files, when I entered. Humbly I approached, and reminded him of who I was, the daughter of Pierre Gerbalat. He's a patriot. Monsieur Gerbalat, the mayor said, nodding his head in approval. It's not everyone who would give 28 trucks to the government for the war, then go, himself, to fight. My father's story was well known. He was something of a hero in Bangui. I have come to see you about my son, I began. He is suffering from an acute attack of malaria. I have here the records of his condition written by Dr. Vincent. Dr. Vincent? He gave them to me today. My son was in the hospital last night, fighting desperately for his life. He cannot endure another crisis. The mayor pushed aside the papers that I had gently laid before him but said nothing. He continued to listen as I explained my case, his eyes going over my person in a way designed to humiliate me as a woman. I know that the distribution of quinine must be authorized by the city hall. That is why I have come to you, Monsieur the Mayor, to ask you for a quinine card, to save my child's life. His eyes slid over me again before he replied, you know very well that we can't make exceptions to the rule. Quinine is for whites only. You are black. That makes your son black. He was very relaxed, cold, at his ease. But Monsieur the Mayor, I begged. I would have dropped to my knees if I thought it would soften his heart. It's my son's life. No exceptions, he said, in icy tones. He's a child, I pled fervently. He is innocent. Let him live. That's all I ask you. Let him live. You heard my answer, he said, his voice rising harshly. Someone led me away. I was outside again. Blindly I ran through the streets. As if in a nightmare, pursued by unknown horrors, I ran. I thought I saw an open tomb in front of me. It was a tomb that I was running toward. The sun beat down on my head pitilessly. I felt as though I were succumbing to madness. I found myself back at the hospital. When he saw my face, Dr. Vincent knew what had happened. "Oh, my poor child," he said, his own features drawn with concern. "Your son is lost." I burst into tears. "If you will write the mayor, you, yourself," I entreated him, explaining how serious it is. "Perhaps you can make him see." Dr. Vincent made out a certificate testifying to the gravity of René's case, adding that he would die if strong doses of quinine were not administered immediately. To this he appended a personal note for the mayor. I ran back to the city hall with these papers. The mayor instructed his secretary to say that he was busy. I was sure this was not true, and I would not be put off by such a hollow device. I pushed my way into his office and found him comfortably settled in an easy chair, watching the flies circling about. "Monsieur the Mayor," I began, thrusting my papers toward him. He stood up, furious. "I told you, no," he shouted. "How dare you bother me with this again?" "Why?" I shouted back. "Why? What good is our French citizenship if we can't have the medicines provided to the French? I am a French citizen, the same as you, and so is my son." Guards were dragging me away, manu militari. I did not go quietly. "Cursed race!" I yelled back at him. "Yours is an accursed race. Cursed authors of a murderous law. Child murderer. You are murderers, murderers, all of you." My heart was bursting. René was being condemned to death because of his bronze-colored skin. I had been asked, why would white people be so cruel to a child who was 3/4 white? My answer is, this was deepest equatorial Africa and the war was on. I think something of the same kind of hatred existed in the old South of the United States at one time toward blacks of mixed blood, because they represented a more subtle threat to the whites. The usual categories of behavior could not be so easily applied. The octoroons were more detested, I have been told, because they were more feared. The deepest human fears often cannot be put into words. And they are the most irrational. I returned home, beside myself. My father was waiting and I told him what had happened. In a rare moment of spontaneity with him I poured out my despair. I could see he was dazed to think he might lose little René. He had become very attached to his grandson. In his old age, grandchildren brought him more pleasure than his own child had, when she was young. Sick and weak though my father was, he decided to see the mayor himself, hoping to make him relent. Painfully my father dragged himself into his old warrant officer's uniform. He hoped that the sight of the decorations would move the administrator to change his mind. As I helped my father walk slowly across the town to the city hall, I was the object of hostile and jeering comments from some of the colonials whom we passed. Word of my scene with the mayor had gotten around quickly. I could hear people laughing about that badly bleached woman who thought she could defy the administration. I cared nothing for their words, or their laughter. I could think of only one thing, to obtain for my little René the medicine that he needed. But the sight of the fragile, beribboned old veteran trembling for his grandson did not change the mayor's heart. The plea failed. That evening when Charles learned of how I had forced myself upon the mayor, he was furious. He thought I was going to turn all the Europeans, on whom he depended for work, against him. They were his public, his clients. He could not afford to have his business damaged by getting on the bad side of the administration and with the people who used his trucking services. "What right have you?" he shouted at me. "For whom do you take yourself?" "For a mother." I shouted back. He stormed out of the house and went to the artillery post. Later he returned with a little package in which there were 15 quinine pills. He threw the package down on the table in front of me and said, "There's your quinine." Nothing at that time gave us any idea that we blacks would ever have our independence, or any rights of our own. When I claimed the right to have medicine for my child, it was an unheard of event. Intolerable. Inadmissible. A month later, another attack, even more severe, made René so ill he had to be hospitalized. His health was too deteriorated to fight the disease. When we took him, in convulsions, to the hospital, I had a presentiment he was going to die. Only when Charles saw the child's agony with his own eyes did he realize the seriousness of the case. Then he came 3 or 4 times a day to the hospital, but it was too late. The malaria had gone into the pernicious stage, last in this terrible illness. As René lay there, gasping in his hospital bed, I was totally helpless against the unspeakable cruelties inflicted on him. By a stroke of fate, Pascal, the child of one of our European neighbors, was hospitalized a few days later in a room close to René's. He was the same age as my son, and he also was in the throes of an attack of malaria, in the pernicious stage. Mosquitoes are not racist and bite all humans, whether white, black, or yellow, with the same ferocity. Our 2 families were good neighbors. I was sad when I saw my son's playmate enter the hospital, but it was even more painful to me later, when I saw that Pascal was receiving the quinine necessary to save his life while my child, only a few meters away, was inexorably sliding down the road to death. I was so terrified of the fate that lay ahead for my child that I refused to believe it. I begged Dr. Vincent to tell me something I could do for my child. He told me to give him apple juice.
Apple juice is best you can get, Nigra, in the Congo. Maybe even from what they were saying with Dikembe Mutombo, it sounded like, you get a glass of apple juice in the Congo like today in the hospital, in the maternity unit. Like, woo, you came up, man. Like, why did you get that apple? Or, we're going to have your child in custody until you pay for that apple juice. Katherine Massey Book Club, Context of White Supremacy. Number to dial, 605-313-5164. The code 564943 pound. Press star 61 if you would like to participate. Hook in the head. This, in fact, I can say, books that I love. When I say, man, I wish they had explained this more. What did they mean when they say that? And then you turn a few more pages, and go, oh, I see. Even got that with this week's reading. And like, what do you mean this Charles dude is brutal? Keep reading, black brother. Keep reading. Like, oh, brutal. Let us see. Folks who dialed in, thoughts on the second portion of the reading. Victim in New Jersey. If you have commentary, I'll nab other hands, and then we'll get our emails as well.
Yeah, Gus. Wow, man. Just pitiful. But not surprising. I mean, this is a region because I've read The Ghost of King Leopold. I read it. I think I read that book in 2000, and it had vivid pictures. It had pictures of Africans, black people with their hands cut off. So when I first heard about the genocide, no, because the genocide in Rwanda happened before, but actually I think I may have been maybe a teenager, so I didn't really pay too much attention during those years. But when the movie Hotel Rwanda came out that brought more attention to that genocide, you know, I was, you know, I when I seen the movie, I already read King Leopold's Ghost, and I knew then, I said, wow, there's a lot of context left out of what led up to this event. But when they say that the father, like, you know, he's, you know, a lot of people give him praise for, you know, lending trucks and also himself going into World War II. So I'm kind of wondering. I'm like, are these all white people that's, you know, that's giving him praise and is happy of his contributions, or also is these black people that's joyous that, you know, French nation prevailed and defeated Germany, you know? So when I hear that, that's what comes to mind. Like, you know, were Africans celebrating in the streets once, you know, the French liberated Paris and, you know, defeated Germany. You know, that's what came to mind. Man, it's pitiful because it's like, you know, this woman and women like her, you know, they're just good for sex. You know, even with his offspring clinging for life, you know, his concern was his business. You know, his concern was, you know, his reputation. You know, and if I'm not mistaken, I remember her saying there was no doubt that this white man, Charles, loved his children. I mean that right now, you know, evidence doesn't show that he really cared about his child. You know, people care about their dogs, you know, until they may start to get unruly, not obey, or even have the nerve to bite. You know, dogs will be put down or given away or, you know, given to a kennel. And these are animals that, you know, white people love dogs, you know, until they turn on them. So with this last situation, with this child clinging for life, he doesn't love his child. You know, he doesn't. And even with the father, getting the strength to get up and walk and, you know, plead for this necessary medicine for his grandchild. And, you know, this was a man that, you know, they praised, you know, he was in high esteem, and the answer was still no, not for a Negro, you know. Oh man, something just fell out. I forgot what I was about to say. Man. I forgot that thought just escaped me that fast. But yeah, so when I think about it, Gus, I'll come back to it towards the end. I'm just a little tired for the night. I had something to say, but I forgot.
Happens to the best of us. Victim in New Jersey, a little bit later on the East Coast as well. Let's see. Any hoodles. If you think of it, let us know. Let's see. Lauren should be with us as well. If you had commentary, proceed.
Yes, sir, I do. So I was thinking the same thing as well when they were talking about when she said he was brutally racist. I was like, what does that mean? And then, okay, he hit somebody in the head with a hook. And yeah, that's pretty brutal. And he didn't seem to care about the injury, not that much. He was just mad that the truck might not go out, or that they took the truck in for the inquiry. Let me see. previous caller, a victim in New Jersey, kind of talked about it. She said, many aspects of Charles's personality displeased me. He was bosh, peevish, racist, brutal with my mother, and wildly jealous. His ideas about the relationship of a man and woman were strange. She's not a woman. Although I felt he loved me, that he depended on me, he never showed it. I had to interpret this for myself. He hardly ever talked to me. He was very closed in on himself, but he loved his two children. It always came back to that. For the first time, I felt myself passively protected, at ease for my daughter and son. So in spite of everything he inflicted on me and my mother, sometimes through carelessness, sometimes deliberately, I thought that with the affection he gave his children, this was a lot. As for myself, I was used to having nothing, so for me, this was no real change. I think it's interesting that she keeps saying their children. They only have one child together, the boy. The little girl, Rita, that's the child she had with Roger. I don't know why she keeps saying it like that. When she described Rita, she said she was of a turbulent nature, lively and gay with a strong personality. Rita sounds a lot like her. The thing Rita did with the meat, where the dog took some of her meat and she took it back and ate it, I thought that also sounded like something she would have done when she was younger. Let me see. I guess I talked about Charles not really caring about this, what I think was a black male who he hit in the head with that hook. I'm not sure it said he was black. That's just what I thought. Let's see. When she wants the medicine, she said the African children who were stricken with malaria often died because they could not have the medicine. This sociologist said, I guess it's white people, was an example of the theory of natural selection at work. The process served, they said, to keep the race sturdy. It made me think of Columbine. It was either Eric Harris or Dylan Klebold. I couldn't remember which one, but one of them wore a shirt that said natural selection on April the 20th, 1999. Let me see. She said, she goes back, she looks in the microscope, she sees all the parasites, sees how heavily infected her son is, and then she tells Charles what she had learned, and he thought she was exaggerating the situation. See, that to me seems like he doesn't care, and if he had access to quinine, he should have went and got it right then. I mean, she had to do all of that other stuff. Then he comes back with the quinine. He could have done that at the very beginning, and she wouldn't have had to go talk to all of those people. She only did that because he didn't seem to care. She tried to get in this club and said quite openly, they said that to accept me as a member would be to prepare the way for Africans with ambition to join their private club. The only way to avoid this was to refuse at the outset anyone with African blood. I don't know what African blood is because white people born in Africa are called Africans. I think African blood means non-white ancestry in that situation. Just white people, man, I have to tell you this. When I first heard you say white people don't care about children, that struck me as being overly harsh, a generalization. But I have come to accept that that is true. And so many examples of it, white people just don't care about children. She said yours is an accursed race, cursed authors of a murderous law. She said child murderer, you are murderers, all of you. That part was accurate. But then she said Renee was being condemned to death because of his bronze-colored skin. No, not because his skin was bronze color, but because the white people were practicing racism. Yeah. The apple juice. I begged Dr. Vincent to tell me something I could do for my child. He told me to give him apple juice. How about go get him some quinine? How about that? And stop practicing racism. That's all I have for this week.
Much obliged, Shamika Harris. Man, I too, when I first thought of, man, white people do not care about children. It's harsh. It's unsavory food, right? It sounds like it shouldn't be codified. You know, you said that people classified as white or, you know, something, race soldiers, or it's uncouth. And, you know, I didn't even want to say it, but it is so widespread, consistent, knows no geographic boundaries. You can look any century. This is beyond a one-time anomaly. No, this is widespread. White people do not. Today, Colt 45 and his father Colin both got charged with murder in Georgia. White people do not care about children. And it was Reb Eric Harris who had natural selection for the Columbine slaughter. Got to kill everybody in the school because we don't care about children. Let's see. Rest of the email number 1 I didn't get to finish. Let's see. The boys. Chapter 8. Charles Groots, above all, was brutally racist. He loved me, I believe that, but in no way loved my race. This is an amazing statement, combining clarity that he is racist along with confusion. He loved me. There's a lot of that in this text, I think. Let's see. Number 2. Papa, he adored Rita. I bet big. Oh, yeah, got that. Read that part. They seemed wonderfully happy together, this innocent, spirited little black woman and this bent, pot-bellied man with often vacant stare. This description reminds me of pedophilia. 6. Patriotism. I never really knew this man who had begotten me. I hear this word, patriotism, used so often, used to describe people classified as white. That's what they call a lot of the January Sixers. That's what they say themselves. We're patriots. We're patriots. I greet you, brother, fellow patriot. That's what the QAnon shaman from January 6th, he was calling some of the folks when they broke into the Capitol. He said, oh, fellow patriot. He's a terrorist. Get out of here. Could it be a euphemism for racism, white supremacy, this word patriot or patriotism? I concur. Your mother was 7. Your mother was so small and frail, she was still a child when I made a woman of her. Her parents left in our nuptial quarters a calabash with cooked gumbo in it. This was a native custom to ease the rite for the bride. Yes, I needed the gluey gumbo in order to consummate our marriage. This is just sickening. What a disgusting degenerate. The whole world is the white man's brothel in the cow's archives. 8. The fact that he deposited me in that institution of purification, as the nuns called it. He was moved by a sense of guilt. As I consider what his dilemma must have been, I think he must have felt guilt, not only toward my mother, Henriette, and me, but also toward the colonial system. Whew. See what I mean? It's like she has stunning clarity, and then, wow. The similarities to Essie Mae Washington Williams and the cow's text, Dear Senator, are striking. Confusion. It is lethal. 9. I knew that he was quite capable of saying that the white race is very superior to the black. This captures for me the essence of why sexual relations between white and non-white are incorrect. You are more than likely having sex and eventually offspring with a racist white supremacist. And all of the evidence shows these white people even if they have a child with a non-white person, they don't even do enough to help that non-white child protect themselves from racism. 10. Charles, some of his ideas were pro-Nazi. He was Bosch. I had to look that up. That's like a French slang for a German soldier. So that's almost like, I think it would translate how, so when someone here, if they are very like a stickler and aggressive about enforcing rules, and particularly in a punitive, draconian fashion, they'll say, wow, you're such a Nazi. I think that's what Bosch means. Like he was Bosch. Yeah, because he said, making your own child go outside where the wolves could gobble her, or whatever, the ants, panthers could gobble her up and eat her food under the lemon tree on her knees. That's Bosch. Peevish, racist, brutal with my mother. Although I felt he loved. Woo, there it is again. Now see, that word love and stunning clarity, and then interracial relationships are sad. That word love, replace white supremacy with love. We don't have no love. Charles, some of his, we got that one. 2 children. Rita was a Nordic type with large green eyes and soft blonde curls. Now see that? Again, they didn't say nothing about no mop of slick blonde. They don't do that. They don't do soft blonde curls that hung to her waist. Shirley Temple. Renee was a fat little brown baby with olive skin, chestnut curls, and black eyes like his father. Is there any doubt that he favored the blonde? Come on. Come on. 12. France had fallen to the Germans. The war had left the French without food. In Paris, people were reduced to eating their dogs and cats. Oh, my God. The Haitians, what is going on? No more Francophones out here stealing dogs and cats. I've had it up there. I've had it up there. Fascinating, given the lies being told about the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. Talk about it. And when she read this and she said that they were desperate for food, and the first item they mentioned was sugar. How in the world? And I know we about at Halloween, so I mean we need Snickers and Baby Ruth's, Reese's Pieces, and don't let me get to those holiday cakes and pies and such. Get me a sweet potato pie going. But if we're in the middle of a war and we have been decimated, the literal Nazis have overrun us and we don't have nothing. The first item on the list for our SOS, and oh my God, we hurting, it cannot be sugar. I mean, even if we get a crate of sugar cubes, what are we going to do with it? Come on, man. Like the sugar and then coffee. Gotta have it. A Welsing moment. Again, gotta have my cup of joe. Man, I guess now I got something to do with the sugar. Let's see. When there were only 50 or 60 packages a month, I did all the work myself. For 3 years, my packages for family was a highly successful enterprise. Would she have been able to have such a business if she was not married to a white man? Probably not. And or having a white parent. Purchase on credit, employee, I agree, probably not. I've been asked, why would white people be so cruel to a child who is 3/4 white? That is totally inaccurate, and that's one of those that reifies the concept of a so-called pure white person or even a pure black person. All of this is nonsense. White people make it up as that. That's how you can have a Sandra Lang too, because there's no such thing as someone being classified as white. Oh, well, never know what might pop out. Henry Reed, Dr. Welsing talked about that too. But no such thing as 3/4 white or octoroon. All that is nonsense of the highest order. Racist lies. Mixed blood, octoroons, the deepest human fears often cannot be put into words, and they are the most irrational. Fear of white genetic annihilation may be the rational explanation one can understand. From this, why the racist white supremacists are so vested in all these racial categories. Absolutely. 15. Charles learned of how I had forced myself upon the mayor. He was furious. He thought I was going to turn all the Europeans on whom he depended for work against him. They were his public, his clients. He returned with a little package in which there were 15 quinine pills. He threw the package down on the table in front of me and said, "There's your quinine. And you insist he, Charles, loved you? She is worthy of great pity." Indeed, we are all, but I mean, maximum racist aggression. And that, for me, would just be another illustration. White people, I mean, what he could have done, same thing that Lauren just said, he could have done this like a long time ago, and enthusiastically. Not what the young people said. Here, damn. Even if it had been Rita, as Lauren eloquently pointed out, that's not his child. They only have the one together. Fine, even if that's your stepchild. That's the way, right? Stepdaughter be a stepdaughter. Even if it had been for her, and he'd be here, damn. White people do not care about children. Too much evidence. Let's see. I'll nab a few of the tidbits from my portion of the reading. She mentioned Clark Gable. And get the correct. There we go. Okay. She mentioned Clark Gable as a reference point. I'm going to go back. When she was talking about Charles, she said, "I would not describe Charles as handsome. He looked quite a bit like Clark Gable." Clark Gable is Superman. Like from way back, way back. Oh, wait a minute. That's not Clark Gable. He's not Superman. Not quite. Clark Gable is Gone with the Wind. Now I'm sure he was in, or I know he was in a number of films, but wow. And that would match up like perfectly with where we are. And in fact, I'd be willing to bet $10 Clark Gable was mentioned in Dear Senator Essie Mae Washington Williams. I'm going to brush my shoulders just because I think that's true. I could be wrong, but we've heard so many of these white movie actresses and actors. Remember that scene in Shawshank Redemption? They're watching and Morgan Freeman sees the white one, throws her long blonde curls back soft to her waist. She throws them back. Rita Hayworth. So we've heard so many of these. Like, you know, it's cliche. He looked like Rhett Butler. Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind? Really? And she even told us, I think it was last week, movies are for white people. You shouldn't even know about Clark Gable. He had to make a stink about even going to the theater. Heard that before, too. I think we might have heard that in Dear Senator, too. Anyway, let's see. He picks the black dude up and throws him on his head. This is Charles, who looks like Clark Gable. Brutal. And it just came in waves, right? Because I was like, what does she mean, brutal? Why does she say that? Put that in context. Oh. Pick a dude up and throw him on the head and give him CTE. Yeah, that's brutal. Mad because your mom comes in the house. Yeah, that's brutal. Punish the daughter out to the limit. That's brute right there, man. Like, wow. Right on. Thank you for the detail. I don't have a whole lot more mystery around that now. Thank you. See, and slammed a hook in. I mean, he could have killed this dude. Easily. Especially this time period. Like, what sort of medical facility he might get to the hospital and say, well, we got some apple juice for you. Dikembe Mutombo, we heard, like, literally. What are they going? We got a hook in the end. We got white doctors. How much do they care about a Negro with a hook in it? And it's apparently a lazy, shiftless Negro. So, I mean, how much are we really going to do? Here, get some. We got a Capri Sun for you. Sip on that, and, you know. Brutal. And they chopping off skulls. That's what I'm saying. They chopping off hands. Like, how much, you know, what is it? Be a lesson to the rest of you. You better hurry up and get that truck loaded. And she said, Lauren, she said he wasn't upset about this. He wasn't guilty. He didn't feel ashamed. He was, man, be late getting the truck loaded. Man, waste time going to like, man, good. Anyway, let's see. He says he's not dead. I got to get the truck loaded, man. Worried about dead niggers. Let's see. They didn't even just say beans. What kind of beans were they desperate for? White beans. Come on. Let's see. She makes this a great bit. Imagine if she had, like, Instagram or something and been able to do all this. Like, wow. Let's see. Charles has these Nazi ideas. I feel like we've heard this before. I'm not that surprised. Even that kind of, now, wait a minute. Now, you can't be patriotic, whatever that means, about France. I'm so happy the Boche, they're getting out of Paris and Vive la France and all that. And like, weeping at the tail. Like, wait a minute now. Your child is about to die. Here, damn, take the quinine. You didn't have no tenderness then, but we're all the way out here, and you weeping about France, but you got Nazi sympathies. Like, wait a minute now. Wait a minute. Now, see, that's one where it's even, now, time out. Now, what is this all about here? This is not really about no country or none of that. I mean, how you going to have Nazi sympathies and you're in France? That can't be unless this is about something else. Aryan Brotherhood. It knows no boundaries. Oh, I see. Even U.S., because we've heard this before, got people in the U.S. and they sympathies and Operation Paperclip, Jim Jones and all that. Oh, I think that was Victim in New Jersey said, hey, we're fighting a war about an ideology. We're not fighting a war about geographical boundaries. Oh, I see. I see. What does it mean to be white? Lame. This guy's so lame. Like, well, even the religion of white supremacy and why she said, this is my plight, I'm to accept the racist nuns. They said, you're worthless nigger, and you specifically, you're the sin, the offspring of a white man. So, the worst of the worst. So, yes, exactly. The original sin. So, I'm supposed to be with this racist brute who's poor and worthless, and I'll just be there. That's my, like, what? What? What kind of religion? And you see, she escaped the church. It wasn't like she was a staunch Catholic and had her rosary and all that. At least not what we heard. She escaped. Still impacted her brain computer. And all those years later. Let's see. One more thing. Get anything else? Oh, wait a minute. She said she crossed the courtyard of the city hall carpeted with white, cracked gravel. That ain't no accident. And I bet they had to invest a lot of time and energy to get white, cracked gravel at the courtyard, sending a message again, the color of domination. Let's see. When she goes to the mayor to get the quinine, and he does all this looking her over like, delectable Negro, get a taste of that. Like, we can make a deal for some quinine. You want to do something strange for some change? That, like, oh my God, that is so degrading. And we've heard that so many times in the book. These white men, got this mixed race mulatto, and propositioning her and sending the boys up like, geez, like, that's all this is all day long. Man. And then worthless Charles gets the quinine. Let's see. Incidentally, I did have a moment where when she said she got thrown out, basically, I said last week when she goes and she starts questioning to learn more about what the system of racism is locally in the Congo and all of that, I said last week, like, man, I don't think this would have been allowed if she was someone who looked like Patrice Lumumba or Joseph Mobutu, dark, highly melanated black person, male or female. This wouldn't be allowed. It would be, get out of here. Where's my cochette? Get on out of here. Stop asking questions. Same thing. Her going to the mayor. We just heard he picked a black dude up and slammed him on his head. You're going to come in here yelling and cursing after we already told you to get the hell out? She could have been killed. It reminds me of Kindred. Octavia Butler said she couldn't write that book with a black dude. Why? He'd have been killed on page 1, and that would have been the end. Patrice Lumumba tries to run back up it. They would have said he was armed and raping a white woman. It's like a number of points in this book where I'm like, wow, this wouldn't, I mean, man, and particularly because she made gender a point. She said, even being a woman going in here, if she was a black dude, slammed on her head. Not saying that would make an improvement. I'm just pointing out the difference. Black male privilege. We will resume next week. Oh, that railroad that she briefed is so many things in this booklet. She'll just briefly mention as she's rolling along that, oh my God, that is like a whole body of research. That is one. So many thousands of black people, non-white people died to put a railroad up basically exclusively for white people for them to loot and plunder goods from Africa. What does it mean to be white? Tomorrow, Neutralizing Workplace Racism, Saturday, compensatory call-in. Let's see. Victim in New Jersey. Was it something super brief you had to share?
Yeah, just real brief. I just what I was thinking about, what I wanted to say, when it said basically this mayor, you know, if he was in France, he would be a nobody, but he was able to, enter the wild frontier of Africa and be a somebody, same as the Europeans who were dispatched to Australia, to New Zealand, to the United States. They will be nothing people. Thought about Nearly Fuller, the royalist system. Instead of kings and queens, whiteness has become a status of royalty within itself. And last but not least, the thing that I wanted to speak about when she compared her child to a Nordic, and I remember her calling her mother naive. That alone is naive, because if I'm not mistaken, Nordic is the white of the white, the purest of the pure. Most white people, they look upon Nordic white people of pure stock, beauty, tall in stature, blonde hair. So to compare your non-white child as compare her to Nordic, you're naive. I mean, she was naive at the time and definitely, like most of us, confused about racism, white supremacy.
For sure. Much obliged victim in New Jersey. Man. What does it mean to be classified as white? And that kind of goes, I think, for everybody here. That the fact, and again, I think that's brilliant that she points that out, the worthlessness, this little tiny nobody white dude in France, he can come down here and he's as full of, I'm a king, a duke, an earl, a mayor, I run the church or whatever, the school, I'm a missionary, I dominate all the dark people here and boss them around and tell them what to do and rape the children, I can kill 10, 15, 20 of them and I'm boss. I'm God. That's what Joseph Conrad wrote about. That's the Congo too, Heart of Darkness. I'm God. We kill them all and laugh about it. Sick the dogs on them and laugh about it. All of it. That's what it is. Like, man, I am having the time of my life. She is absolute. Why would I feel guilty about any of this? I'm having the time of my life. I can go on safari whenever I want. I'm having the time of... Why would I want to die an old, nobody, lame white dude in France? I can come down here, get me a side piece, black girl or boy, both, harem, eat good food. They don't have fresh mangoes in Paris this time of year. And it's in ruins, man. Europe is in ruins. It's going to take years for them to get all that rebuilt and the Monroe Doctrine and all that. Man, I'm chilling down here. I'm going to get some sun, get me some of these black children hoes, eat me some food, be chilling, loving it. I went from being a no-count white person to ruler, God of the Congo. Goddess of the Congo. Cachette on my hip. We will resume next week. Again now, who was this book for? It's in the University of Washington Library. Do you know any black people who read this book? I know white people who read this book. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. No name calling. Black people heard more of that this week. No throwaway offspring heard more of that this week. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
Yeah. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my condition.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.